We're live. Okay. All right, I call to order this Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, April 19th, 2022. And we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. Now, I had the opportunity on this Easter weekend to be driving to and from Saskatoon, which is a long drive. Jeremy too. And you have a lot of time to think. And one of the things I was thinking about is how the truth and reconciliation process for those of us in the settler community, a lot of it is like changing a painting that already exists in your mind and restructuring it. And what came to my mind was I'm originally from Edmonton, and the Fairmont Hotel McDonald there, some years ago, had a renovations done. And so a lot of us that knew it from in the 70s and the 80s, it had a certain look, and that's what the Hotel McDonald was like on the inside. And they started to do these renovations, and they discovered that in fact there was a whole bunch of false walls and false ceilings that were hiding this ornate architecture and some incredible art. And I don't know why people covered it up, but they covered it up, and that's what everybody thought was real, but it wasn't real. And so this whole process that many of us are going through is knocking down the walls that are covering up the beauty that is actually there that we didn't even know existed. And it's recalibrating this paradigm shift and creating a new picture in our minds. And it's not something that is just being developed. It was there all along and we just didn't see it. So that's what I think of a lot now when I'm thinking in terms of truth and reconciliation. And in that spirit then, and in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge the Canmore area, known as Shooting at Willows, in Stoney Nakoda, and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Stoney Nakoda, comprised of the Bears Paw First Nation, Chiniki First Nation, and Wesley First Nation, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai. We acknowledge that this territory is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge all nations who live, work, play, and help us steward this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. Now turning to the agenda for today's meeting, are there any changes or additions? No? So I'll move approval of the agenda for April 19th, 2022 Committee of the Whole meeting as presented. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. And now we have a visit from Mr. Elborn from artsPlace, a delegation for the annual review. Welcome to council. Whenever you're ready, the microphone is yours.
To figure out how to do this. Thank you, Your Worship and members of Council, for the opportunity to present our strategic plan to you today. The Canmore area, known as Chonchemchen Kudebi, has been a gathering place for generations. Countless storytellers, artists, musicians, and makers have graced these lands to trade stories, ideas, and inspiration. It is in this collective spirit that we do our work, and the spirit within which we entered our planning process. I will be as concise as...
Sorry to interrupt you, but we're having a problem getting your presentation onto the screen for all the viewers at home. So we just need you to stop. I'm so sorry. It was a great start. Go on.
I'm in it. It says plug HDMI cable into device.
You want to check the...
not connected? No. We can show it on our system.
Yeah.
Just have your stick, we can show it from our computer, I think.
This happened to me every time I do this. It doesn't work.
It was a fantastic start.
It makes a little bit of sense without the slides.
Oh, it says start sharing now.
So will this move forward with me or not?
Okay.
There's a lot of looking, just saying. Okay. Do I get extra time now? Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your patience.
I will be as concise as possible in this presentation, but feel it is important to tell the story of the process we have been through and where the plan came from. I'm going to start with what hasn't changed, our mission and vision. We did look at whether they needed to be updated, but felt strongly that both still worked really well within the context of the broader plan. What is new is the opportunity, which I will speak to shortly. The methodology we opted for was chosen to emphasize the positive and our success as a starting point, while also being designed to be inclusive of all of our stakeholders. SOAR stands for Strengths, Opportunities, Aspirations, and Results. The first session brought together a broad cross-section of our stakeholders to look at our strengths and their aspirations for us as an organization. As such, the community-based process design team was asked to come up with a framing or what has been termed our opportunity. That is to say that we were gathering to try and accomplish. This framing turned out to be so representative of what we heard that we chose to retain it as an important theme for the strategic plan. The group was asked to answer these questions, or put another way, based on what we do well, to dream a little. The first part of the day was focused on the strengths part of SOAR. In summary, what we heard is that artsPlace is the heart center of the Bow Valley. People really love what we have been doing, and in fact, can't imagine Canmore and the Bow Valley without artsPlace. It really was a wholehearted endorsement and validation of everything that we have been doing and all of our hard work. One other really important takeaway is that although we are evolving and broadening our scope, we can never lose track of what has made us successful and the core of what we do. In the afternoon, the group of stakeholders was asked to dream. In 10 years, what would you like artsPlace to be? Given the state of the world and everything we had collectively been through, both locally and globally, it probably wasn't too much of a surprise that we were in essence being tasked with saving the world. Putting this in perspective, we were able to narrow people's aspirations down to 3 strong themes, which we have termed values-driven. As it became clear that we were being asked to espouse certain values shared by our community rather than specific, more concrete initiatives. artsPlace will extend its reach beyond its current physical space. There was a lot of conversation around different ways this should happen, everything from new physical infrastructure to exploring unused spaces to physically and virtually bringing our programming out into the community. artsPlace will be a model of diversity, accessibility, and well-being for all. This is a theme that we heard consistently and loudly throughout the engagement process, and a road we've been going down organizationally already. In fact, we took great care to engage with both our Stoney Nakoda partners and newcomers to the Bow Valley through a series of focus groups and interviews to ensure that all voices would be heard and considered in our thinking. There was a really strong consensus on this aspiration in relation to communities that are currently underserved, with youth being seen as particularly important in addition to immigrant and Indigenous populations. artsPlace through the arts will be a facilitator of positive conversation and social good. I would say that this aspiration was probably the most contentious of the three, with many worried artsPlace staff and artists feeling they were being unfairly burdened with this responsibility of saving the world. Upon reflection, we shifted the focus to listening and facilitating the conversations that the community want to have, rather than dictating what they should be. And in the case of artists, giving them the freedom and a safe space to explore what they are interested in, not dictating what art should explore. So what should be the big takeaway from these values-driven aspirations? That fundamentally we need to continue to listen to our community and honor these shared values by using the three main themes as a framework for both this plan and organizational decisions we will take moving forward. This brings us to session number 2, which represented the O in SOAR, or opportunities. On a practical level, what was discussed at the second session was really the identification of strategic priorities and goals. That is to say, exploring what more we can do to serve our Bow Valley community, inspired by the identified themes of growth, accessibility, and positivity, while respecting those things that our community values most about us. Based on session 1 and 2, we landed on 3 achievable strategic priorities to guide us through the 2022 to 24 timeframe of the overall strategic plan. While these are numbered 1 to 3, they do not appear in any priority order and are framed by our community's aspirations for us. Extend our reach and accessibility both physically and beyond our 4 walls to impact more people across the Bow Valley. Going back to that first aspiration, this strategic priority is about exploring what expansion could mean from new physical spaces to expanding partnerships, using existing spaces creatively to finding new ways to deliver programs, or perhaps, put more succinctly, expanding our capacity. Expand our programming to make the arts and arts activities more accessible to all residents of the Bow Valley. Accessibility here is defined as removing barriers so that everyone in the Bow Valley can feel comfortable participating in and benefiting from our programs. Listening to our community of stakeholders, the priorities within this area are underserved communities in many different senses of the word, and youth as a distinct entity. Increase funding, resources, and dedicated supports to facilitate growth and evolve and supplement our existing programs with a particular focus on truth and reconciliation through Indigenous arts and artist development. This priority area is really about making sure that we have the right financial, human, and other resources in place in order to accomplish our strategic priorities and honor our stakeholders' aspirations for us, while respecting our stakeholders' wishes by focusing that growth on 2 key areas: Indigenous arts and the development of current and future artists. The final piece of the SOAR SOAR process is results. This is where the artsPlace team of staff and board sat down and really explored refining the plan, brainstorming specific operational initiatives and resource requirements. Looking at the defining priorities and the data from 3 planning days, we established goals and operational initiatives for each priority. Due to time restrictions, I won't go into a lot of detail. There is a fair amount of consistency and overlap in all 3 priorities, which helps in that regard. However, there are a handful of initiatives I will highlight. Please note that the goals have been framed initially within the context of 2022, or the first year of the plan. Moving forward, specific goals will be added based on success in achieving the current goals and in conjunction with annual operational plans as well as available resources. It has become clear both through stakeholder comments and as we set about to establish goals that in order to measure results, assess our progress, and evaluate impact, we needed first to establish a baseline of where we are now. At the same time, we still need to ensure that we are moving forward. So understanding our environment and starting the process of developing specific and achievable plans is an important parallel process. You therefore see these two base goals reflected across all three priorities. Within the first set of strategic initiatives, I'd like to stress that it is vitally important that we work closely with Chris and the Arts and Events team to fully integrate and respect the Town of Canmore's cultural master plan. Exploring space needs and the support of emerging artists are just two examples of synergy between the two plans. Within strategic priority number 2, I would like to highlight 2 initiatives. The first is the development of a strategic partnership and opportunity plan with a focus on youth and underserved communities. One other strong message we heard was the desire for us to partner with existing organizations. This is actually something we already do extensively, but obviously this story has not been told well enough, and certainly more work can be done in that area. The second initiative I'd like to highlight is gathering community feedback. Once again, this is something we currently do, but mostly informally. If we are to be truly responsive and inclusive, we need to do it better and more systematically. In this last strategic priority area, I'd like to highlight the final initiative. A common theme that developed during the planning process was many staff members pointing out that we were already doing many of the initiatives that were being suggested by our stakeholders. The main takeaway here is that we need to do a better job of telling those stories. If we do, that will go a long way towards supporting our funding and other resource needs. That concludes my rather rapid presentation. Complementing this plan is our 2021 annual report, which I believe has been handed out to all of you, which does tell some of those stories. We're also developing a public-facing version of the strategic plan, which we'll also send out to you when it's done. Thank you for all your time, and I'd like now to turn it over to you for your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elborn. And I would just like to say, given this first public opportunity to do so, thank you to artsPlace for Canmore being recognized as having the most number of cultural events and activities of communities our size of anywhere across Canada. And so that was, notice of that was sent a few months ago, but this is the first time you've been here since then. So thank you for putting us on the map in that way.
My pleasure. I was just one of a few organizations that managed that, but yes, thank you.
Opening up to council for any questions. Councillor Ma? Councillor Ma.
Thank you so much there, Mr. Elborn, for a great presentation. When you guys were talking about expanding capacity, there is some reference to physical spaces. Is this with respect to the current artsPlace space, or I'm just curious where you're coming from?
So there isn't a specific answer to that yet.
Okay.
So I think the stage we're at right now is we're exploring what those opportunities might be. I think once we have identified opportunities, then there's obviously, we have to look at it in terms of our actual needs. So that's part of the parallel process, if you will, as well too. Certainly, we're also looking at maybe underutilized spaces or taking a more creative approach. But I think there are many different ways that we can approach this, and I think once we've kind of done due diligence on that front, I think I'll be able to give you a more succinct answer to that. But I think it's certainly on the table, and it's something that we would like to explore. But there's certainly environmental impact and other questions that cost, raising the money, all those things that need to be examined as well too. So, and not to mention copious amounts of water flowing into the town and things like that.
And just like personally, I have 2 daughters that attend your programs, and we go as a family, and thank you for what you guys do. You're tremendous. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Councillor Faubert.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Elborn. And I'm really excited to see the results of the strategic planning process. It began while council was at Alberta Municipalities Conference. So it would have been nice to be a part of it, but I'm glad that now we're a part of seeing it. My question kind of is a follow-up similar to Councillor Ma, in looking to kind of expand what you offer, either in a physical space or outside, or are you looking to work with other possible groups that might also be looking
Yeah.
for spatial
No,
needs?
absolutely. So I think that was one thing I neglected to mention in relation to Councillor Ma's question, but yes, I think partnerships is really key. So I know there are a number of organizations, individuals that are looking at expanding their capacity in terms of, which may translate into physical space as well too. So I think I'm already having some of those conversations. Certainly, the Canmore Museum is top of our list, and Ron and I have certainly talked a lot already.
I wasn't going to say anything.
But there's other people out there as well too, and I think that's part of the process that we're exploring. So it's not, like everything we do, it's about working together and complementing as opposed to competing with, so it doesn't make any sense for us to be, building 27 arts venues in this town. Maybe at some point, but not now.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions of council? Councillor Graham.
I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Elborn, for all the work you've done as of late, watching your team and the board do the work that they have done to date for me has been a great pleasure. I look forward to your success in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor. I almost said Borrowman, but I didn't.
It's going to be a long 3.5 years. And thank you, Mr. Elborn, for coming to see us today. As you know, my kids use your program as well. One of them. The
I
other
do.
one is.
That one.
I noticed in your presentation you spoke about looking to put more programming out for youth. And I was wondering if you could expand on some of the ideas that you might have had, or is that still to be continued, to be announced?
I think it's premature to
We have a
kind
lot
of
of youth
talk about.
programming as it is,
There's
I
a lot
wanted
of
to say.
there's a lot of programming already, and I think certainly with youth, our focus is on free programming. Certainly beyond, I guess, certainly into the teenage years as well too. So I think what we're recognizing is there's still a bit of a void there. So I think we're going to start with exploring partnerships in terms of what we can do there. That's less about physical capacity. It's more about how can we bring our programming to the youth, and in a way that they will want to do it, as opposed to us kind of jamming it down their throat. That's nothing worse than telling a teenager what to do. Right?
Really?
So, yeah. You notice that? Yeah.
I have 2 teenagers. And I guess, I don't know if you're seeing this with other clients of artsPlace, but I have a kid that has done all the things, and now is starting the high school or the teenage programming. But at some point, I have a feeling that her thirst for, to get better at what she does is going to outstrip maybe what artsPlace has to offer. And I'm hoping that that's a whole, with this partnership conversation that you're having, that you can maybe fill, not just for me, I'm sure there's other kids that are in the same situation. No?
I mean, yes. I mean,
Please say yes.
I fundamentally agree. I fundamentally, yes. I mean, that certainly is the objective. Certainly, if we're referencing your daughter specifically.
No,
I mean,
I'm just assuming that she's
really
not the only
engaged
one.
with.
Yeah.
No, I don't. I'm not going to embarrass her in public, but she's really engaged with ceramics, and we know,
Yes.
for instance, that ceramics is the one program where we have definite capacity issues,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So that, I think that's, if we're looking at potential, finding alternate spaces for that. So how can we look at doing that? It's not just the physical space, it's the kiln capacity and
Of
things like that
course.
as well too. So I think there's, I think to be positive in relation to your question, yeah, those are definitely the type of thing that we want to explore. How we're actually going to do it, to be determined. So.
You're smart. It'll be fine.
Some
Thank you.
days.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Elburn, for your presentation today, and please bring our gratitude and congratulations to your entire team and to your board, I know some of whom are here today. Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Now turning to item C, the minutes of the March 15th, 2022 Committee of the Whole meeting. Are there any errors or omissions that anyone noted? Seeing none, I'll move approval of the minutes of the March 15th, 2022 Committee of the Whole meeting as presented. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. We'll now move to item D1. Staff reports the 2021 High Turbidity event. Mr. Como, welcome to council.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Mayor Krausert. So yeah, we're here to talk about the 2021 High Turbidity event we had back last year, the end of the summer. And just as a reminder, the purpose is to provide council with an update on the investigation that we've taken place since the event and the subsequent boil water advisory was lifted shortly afterwards. Part of the presentation today is I have three members from EPCOR that I'd like to introduce. So the first one is Vicki Campbell, who is our senior manager of capital growth and operations. And then we also have Kevin Visser, who you've met before, who is their senior manager of regional operations. And then finally, we have Alec McKenzie, who is actually the program manager of the South Bow River Loop project, which is the wonderful project that got this all started. So just a quick reminder, because we are, it was a previous council when this event occurred, so just for everyone's benefit, and obviously some time has passed. So the South Bow River Loop was a project approved by council in two phases, just over the $3 million mark for each phase, so quite an expensive project and a very important and valuable project that was, the intention was to provide a looping or another secure way to get water from one side of the valley to the other, because we only had one. So if something happened with that, we had this other one. And the other one that was the driver for the project was to improve fire flows in the Kananaskis Way area, which were, up until the project is complete, were below what we wanted to see in our engineering design standards. So pretty important project. Some of the other benefits that came out of it is we didn't have potable water at the wastewater treatment plant or the new waste management center. So there were some benefits as well, so we were able to tie all of those in. The project was done in 4 sections. The first one was coming from the Three Sisters Parkway, the viewpoint, across the Tipple site to the wastewater treatment plant. So that was part 1. Part 2 was to tie it into the wastewater treatment plant itself so they would have potable water. Part 3 was to get it, run another line to the new waste management center that was going through an upgrade at that time. So it was good timing. And then the fourth is the one running from the wastewater treatment plant along the access road out towards Bow Valley Trail, and that's the one that sparked all of this issue. And so EPCOR was managing the project. The intention was to commission the line back at the last week of July, and then of course Thursday, July 29th. As expected, before a long weekend, some residents in the Creek area started to experience turbidity in their water. And so I thought, what a wonderful way to just leave it for me and now hand it over to EPCOR to talk about a little bit more summary of what happened after that occurred, and then the results of the investigation they've subsequently done since things have been resolved.
Great.
Okay. Just one other thing I would also add is the investigation, there are some parts in there that are confidential, and so just if there requires a response from us that requires us to the answer shouldn't be shared in public, we may ask to go in camera so we can share more of that information freely with council. Great. And the other is we would like this presentation to be somewhat interactive, so throughout, if members of council have any questions, please let us know.
Great.
And with that, I will hand it over to Ms. Campbell, who will begin the presentation.
Great, thank you. Ms. Campbell, welcome to council.
Thank you. I should also note Dennis Letourneau, our site manager here in Canmore, he's on a long vacation and he's unable to make it today, so that's why he's not here. Yeah, he's in Europe, so he's doing pretty good. So he deserved a rest for sure. Is it on? Thank you. Okay. So I'm I also wanted to mention that Alec McKenzie is not on the slide here, but he's sort of taken on the remainder of this project as of January. So we're all reflecting back on some of the lessons learned and the events through different lenses, actually. So I'm going to start with a brief summary of the event, and Andreas gave a pretty good overview of the background, so I'll just pretty much gloss over those slides unless anybody has any specific questions. I've got some technical information in there too, just to give you an overview of what turbidity is, what the distribution system would typically look like, and then we're going to get into what the emergency response was from, you know, what the town would have experienced, and then a little bit more about what EPCOR and what we did on a personal level, and how we really rallied our troops to help get the boil water as quickly as possible. And we'll also go into our investigation findings, some challenges and things to consider, as well as a timeline for the remainder of the project. Thank you. So what is turbidity? So turbidity is sediment or particulate that is in the water. And it's a measure that we use in water treatment and water distribution systems to reflect the cloudiness of a water sample. And really it's present in all distribution systems, and that's why it's measured and it's carefully watched. And so there's a photo there of what low turbidity is you know, really difficult to see with the naked eye, and there's high turbidity, which is demonstrated there in that slide.
So what would be the mark of acceptable? Wouldn't I see the NTUs there?
Less than 5.
Less than 5 is acceptable.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's typically less than 1.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So this diagram, and I know you won't be able to read all the writing on there, but it was a good one to demonstrate what typically happens in a distribution system. So the sediment, and you know, it's pretty dark and brown and cloudy there, is typically flushed through a regular program, through a hydrant, and discharged over land. And later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about why that's difficult in Canmore and how we ended up in a position where now we're looking at how to do that differently. So if you just want to hold that thought, I'm sure you have some questions on this, and we might circle back to this slide after, but I wanted to talk about what flushing is. It's really clearing those lines, and it's typically done, you know, it depends on the system, but it's typically done on a routine basis, and it could be annually, it could be a different frequency, but really it's mineral deposits. It could be like rust from valves that have corroded. It could have been some biofilm develops over time, and sediment from, say, a crack in the piping that dirt can get in through. It's typically considered safe because the chlorination and the other practices that happen in distribution systems. But as we get into the event details here, I'll speak to why it was determined that a boil water advisory might be the best way to go for this particular situation. So here is the sort of the layout of the South Bow River Loop line, and it's really to connect the two pressure zones. It is a project that lasted over several years, and I don't know if you have any particular questions on this slide or the next one, but we included the content here in case we wanted to get into some further details from what Andreas was providing. So really there was, it was a lengthy project, and it was really important to the town to have this additional capacity for fire flows and many other potable water redundancy purposes. So what happened on this day? So I actually haven't been involved in the town of Canmore's wastewater operations up until October of last year. But on this particular week, I happened to be filling in for my boss, who is our director of regional operations, Christian. And so I happened to be the one that people called on this particular event. So I'm just lucky that way. So anyway.
Congratulations.
That's right. So what happened on this day? The line was commissioned because we had it already constructed, all results as far as water quality inside the line and bacteriological results all were fine. So what happened on this particular day on July 29th is the operators were working with the design engineer and the contractor, and they were trying to set the, see there's a new PRV, so that's a pressure reducing valve, and Canmore has many of them because the complex, the mountains, the distribution, yeah, you really have to be careful in controlling the pressure or you'll blow a line apart. So they were carefully setting the settings of this new PRV valve. They opened up the boundary valves to connect the two systems, and the turbidity event happened. And so we'll get into the events of what happened after that. So they brought that line onto service. EPCOR began receiving calls from residents that there was brown water happening. And then, so I got a call, and it was maybe about 12:30 in the afternoon. And so then I escalated it internally. We contacted the town. I think Andreas was away that day as well. So we contacted everyone we could, communications, and escalated it to the province and Alberta Health Services. And at that point in time, with Alberta Health Services, nobody could be 100% sure if that turbidity was coming from the brand new line or from the existing distribution system. And to be safe, they all decided that a boil water advisory was the way to go on this one, so that the public interest was protected and that everyone was safe. So EPCOR determined that Emergency Operations Center was required because this is a significant event in our business. And we want to make sure that, you know, the belts and suspenders approach, that we provide all the resources and all the support that we can to the people in the field. The next morning, the town also established its emergency coordination center, so they call it something just a little bit different, but it's really the same thing. The emergency alert for Canmore area was issued, and then EPCOR developed and executed our plan for flushing the water lines. Throughout that day still, we were also looking at, from the outside of the perimeter inward, what areas we knew would be safe immediately and we can take out of that boil water, and what areas were maybe ones that we needed to be more careful with. And so that was happening throughout that day and evening. SEMA Plus was brought into the discussion because this is an engineering firm that also has the town's hydraulic water model. So it's a computer model. And with their help, along with everyone else that was working together, we were able to successfully rule out certain areas that there's no way the water would have gotten to that point. And so this is what happened that afternoon. We also established potable water stations. And actually, so we brought in people from our other operations, and Alec was manning and making sure we had enough potable water stations. We were running samples into town to labs. And so the next couple of slides here, I want to just go through a little bit more of the amount of effort that it is to manage something like this successfully. So we set up the potable water locations, and that was arranging different companies to haul in water from Calgary and other areas. We systematically flushed and tested water in segments, and so that we could make sure each zone, we knew what was happening in there. By August the 4th, so this was throughout the long weekend and all the following week, we had EOC meetings 2 or 3 times a day with regulators, with the town, making sure that everybody knew what they needed to do. And by August the 4th, the town disabled their ECC, but we kept going until the full advisory was lifted so we could make sure we had all hands on deck to provide the resources and support. So this is the area that was impacted. It's a fairly large area, but those were the distribution system is so complicated, and it was the way that we decided would be the safest approach. So part of our emergency response was developing a low-velocity flushing plan, and we worked with Alberta Environment and Parks, Alberta Health Services, the town, and SEMA Plus to do that. We also secured additional support operations folks, people from Edmonton, so we deployed a number of different operators and health and safety and quality control experts from Edmonton to come and help. And then this lasted until August the 9th at about 4:30 p.m. So in all, EPCOR sent 14 operators so that we can continue on with shifts 24/7. And this was a big effort. They came with trucks and supplies and equipment, and we're very pleased with the support that we received. We had a number of other folks involved behind the scenes, from health and safety to quality assurance to different management levels. And we also wanted the town to know that we had not passed along any of these costs to the town. The town of Canmore is a very important customer for us, and so we provided this as part of our emergency operations support. Next slide, please. So what we found in the investigation, there were 3 key factors. So to perform the investigation, we wanted to be extremely thorough. We brought in a couple of experts from Edmonton Distribution Operations, and they went through all the construction data, they went through all the different documentation pieces, and interviewed people as well. And from internally and the consultant and the contractor. And, part of the story is how complex the Canmore distribution system is with the different elevations, with the pressure reducing valves, with the interconnections of some of these, let's just say this doesn't happen in Regina where I'm from. You pretty much know, right? Here it's a little bit more tricky. But there was the accumulation of sediment in the existing distribution system was most likely the cause of the high turbidity. And that's due to the lack of the routine flushing program, and I'm going to get into that in the next couple of slides here, why that hasn't been done. And I've got some more of that story to tell as well. And the other part is a detailed hydraulic computer model. So SEMA Plus's model that they have sort of as in the background, that computer model wasn't fully used to determine the impact of increasing the velocity and reversing the flow that created this turbidity event. So what have we done since then? So we've revised the scope of work for the design engineer. They are still continuing on with the construction pieces of as-built design, but we've engaged SEMA Plus to help with the next set of commissioning that we need to do in the town. And they are hard at work right now at a computer model for a hydraulic system. It includes like thousands of pieces of data, every pipe diameter, the velocities, each valve, and so it's a lot of work to keep something like that up to date and reflective of what's happening in that system. But they're going through it right now, and whatever we do next is going to be incorporating those results, and that's part of the lessons learned and how we do things differently after this point. So some of the challenges that we've been working through over the last couple of months. So sediment is in every distribution system, like I had mentioned, but the unidirectional flushing program has been difficult to implement in Canmore. We've talked about it over the years, but the complexity of the system, but also where do you put the water? So Canmore has some unique issues where the flush water can't be discharged over land, like in this photo here, which is a typical way of handling it. These sensitive areas in the valley bottom, there's not a full storm sewer system like in most communities that we could just discharge it to. And so there's a lot more challenges than easy way of doing things. And so now we're working through what some of those are and how we can maybe look at it differently using newer technology. The volume and capacity limitations in the distribution system have also made it tough to get the volume and the velocity of the water we need to flush out those lines. And so the catch-22 is that's where South Bow River Loop, the line that we were commissioning, comes into play. So we needed that velocity, that pressure, that amount of water in order to do this in the other parts of the system. But we, so now that line's there, and I have a schedule up here that we can talk through in just a minute. We've also engaged another technical expert, GHD, and they're looking at the alternatives for cleaning the existing distribution system pieces that we really want to get to. Now, there's only 4 shown here, but there's like pigging lines, which is a foam plug. There's air scouring. There's a unique technology, which is kind of a closed-loop system based with a truck, and that's that lower left. There's ice pigging. There's about 3 or 4 other kinds that they're looking at as well, that some are a little more aggressive from the perspective of the whole area needs to be isolated and before the work can be done. So we're working through that, and we're going to have a report by the end of this month, and then we'll have a decision. We'll work through town administration as well, and we'll go from there. But the areas of concern are the ones that went through the boil water, and so the Cougar Creek area, Elk Ridge area, and the Kananaskis Way are the ones that we're looking at that could really use the cleaning. So what's next? So right now we're going through, we're talking back and forth with SEMA. They're finalizing that hydraulic model so that when the valves are open next time, everybody knows what's going to happen. And what can we do about it? And so they're also recommending where we might need another hydrant, where we might need some more valves, so that that system can be controlled to the level that we need it to when we turn this back on. We're also having them consider, so if we have to reverse the flow in some of the areas, that's what will stir up some of that turbidity. Because when you think about it, if you've got sediment lying flat on a pipe and you've got a strong laminar flow, that doesn't stir it up. But if you're reversing the flow in a high velocity, and that's what happens, and that's what happened pretty much in this situation. So how do we do this again without creating any trouble? And so that's what we're going through right now carefully. And so there's a little bit more work to do yet, but it's coming along really nicely. And that's what we have for you today. But
Great, thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions, and then perhaps other councillors do as well. When you were talking about the response to the boil water order and the flushing that was done, you made a point that it was low velocity flushing that was chosen. I was just wondering, what does that mean? Does it mean you're not wanting to stir up more? Was there other options that you could flush it faster, but it would be a problem? Or?
Well, that was, I guess, selected more by segments and by which area. If we could get enough flow without making problems more worse. We also had to make sure we had enough reserve for fire flow.
Right.
And so that's another challenge, because we wouldn't want to be flushing a system and not have enough should a fire happen somewhere else. Right. So there is a lot to consider through that. But especially with South Bow offline, now that we have South Bow ready to be deployed, it's going to be a careful consideration on how we can do that with higher velocity to scour those lines as much as possible.
Right. And you mentioned one of the learnings was that hydraulic modeling was not done, but now it is being done. Was it not usual practice to do it?
No, it's not. Like, not to the degree that we're doing it for this particular restart. You know, it's done to model if we need a new section of line somewhere else, and how does that draw from the rest of the system. Right. But for a regular commissioning of a line like this, it's not a typical endeavor, and not to the degree of what we're doing right now, looking at reversing the flow and making sure that we have what we need to make this as successful as possible.
Great, thank you. Looking to council to see if there are any questions. Councillor Faubert.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You said that the cost of the event is being covered by EPCOR. Mm. And the way I kind of am putting this in my head is that there's like an operational cost and perhaps a cost to finishing the capital project. Mm-hmm. When it comes to finishing that capital project, is that still on budget in
Correct.
Terms of our approvals?
That's right, yeah.
And so that project itself doesn't cost more now to complete, it's just still on track.
It is on track, and if you want to know some details of that, we might want to go in camera for that piece. Because as we're trying to figure out how much some of these flushing and cleaning technologies are, the quotes are just coming back in, so we may need to adjust it, but we're on target right now for the original.
And then the operational response to address
Yeah.
the emergency and then up till now, what can you tell us what that has cost? And would it normally be something in terms of an emergency situation and our contract where EPCOR covers that? Or is this just specific to this scenario?
Everything about this is quite unique. So I think we can take that maybe offline, and we can certainly share that with you.
Councillor Ma?
Thank you for your presentation. On your second slide, you had pictures of like various degrees of turbidity. At the worst case scenario during this event, what was our number of turbidity were we getting?
Well, and each hydrant that they opened, it was always something different. And some of them hadn't been opened in a while, and so that tends to build up at that location. So I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of you, but I think it would be fair to say that the numbers just varied across the board. And like even if you turn on your tap, right, even if we came to your house and collected a sample for lead, we'd have to let that sample run for 20 minutes to be sure that what we're collecting is representative of the drinking water. And so it's the same in the distribution system, where things at that one location can build up, and some are worse than others. And so I would say it's probably fair to say that we saw water all over the place right now.
Okay, so there was some stuff in those pictures.
Sure,
though,
yeah,
like,
there
okay.
was.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the
I was
point.
just trying to understand this part. When you guys went through the flushing process afterwards, where did the water go when you guys flushed it in that process? Like, I'm trying to understand this part too.
Okay, oh, good.
Yeah, because I was hearing like we can't push it out somewhere, but then we still
That's right,
flushed
yeah.
it. And how did we flush it?
Yeah, so especially on the valley bottom, really high groundwater levels prevents us from basically putting in a traditional storm system. So we actually had, we call them a recon team. So we had operators from Kananaskis, Strathmore, and Chestermere that came out to help, and they were actually scouting spots where we could discharge to,
Okay.
so it didn't flood
Right.
people's basements and garages
Okay.
and everything else. So we had the crews that were flushing, then we had the recon team going to the next location, spotting on where we could put the hoses and everything else. So there was a lot of coordination going into that. And another purpose of the low volume flushing is exactly that. We couldn't get up to the scouring pressures that you would traditionally have on a UDF. So we were after just a turnover of the pipe, right, to get whatever was in the pipe and basically got stirred up out. And then, in some places we were going into trees, but we can't discharge directly into a water body. There's rules around that from Alberta Environment as well. So, it was a bit of a sticky wicket
Okay.
all the way around. But,
All right.
yeah.
You guys keep track of all those locations just in case for next
Oh,
time?
we do,
It's absolutely. We'll never throw that away.
Awesome.
Just
Thank
because
you.
I don't want to do it twice.
Yeah. Thank you,
Nobody
sir.
does.
I was just curious.
Might help with the routine flushing.
Yeah.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder if you might be able to share with us any of the results from AHS and the water testing that was done. Was community safety ever at risk?
Oh, that's a good question. There wasn't any, but I don't have any data with me today.
Well,
Do you have anything here?
no, not, like as far, we didn't send in samples into the lab. The only samples we took into the lab were we recommended that a zone was clear.
Right.
And then we took bacteriological
At the end,
samples
yeah.
at the end. And then once, and we were hot-shotting those into the provincial lab in Calgary, and then they give the all-clear saying there's no bacteriological concerns in the water. And then that's how we got the all-clear from Alberta Health Services at the end when we cleared zones. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm unclear on when a boil water advisory is actually issued. Does AHS say there's something wrong with this water? We need to
No,
Well, water
it's
or
the
did-
potential, it's the potential.
The
Yeah.
potential of it,
Yeah,
okay.
so if we have cloudiness, we don't know exactly what makes up that cloudiness. Vicky,
Yeah.
spoke to, you know, we were actually at the time, we're still unclear on what the actual source of the turbidity was, whether it was the new line, the existing line, what that was. So because we don't know exactly what was making up the cloudiness, what was the source, it was just a precautionary. That's why we went town-wide, just to make sure that nobody was drinking it. We provided potable water in all of the filling stations so people could drink, cook, all of that. But just to make sure that we were clearing the line so that the water coming out of the tap, we could assure that it was safe to drink and consume.
Right, so it was that South Bow line, it punched through, like, under some railway tracks, under, there's many pieces of construction there that at the time of the boil water, we weren't sure if that was some residual mud, and that's where the concern comes in. But through the investigation, where the records from construction made us all comfortable that it wasn't from that line. So looking back now, we know that there wasn't a risk. But at the time, we had to be as cautious as possible. So if that answers your question a little bit more.
Yeah, I think everybody takes potable water for granted.
Absolutely.
All of
Yeah.
the time when we let it run, and
Yeah.
it's not until you don't have it that it's a major
Exactly.
concern, and
Yeah.
thank you for all your efforts there.
Any other questions? Councillor Faubert.
Thank you. I also just want to say that the best pun of the day is that we're unclear on the cause of turbidity.
We've got a lot of puns in our business, by the way. They're great.
You may have gone over this a bit in one of the prior answers, but we don't usually do unidirectional flushing in Canmore because of the complexity. But it's something that a system like ours could benefit from.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did this event result in our system being flushed because of all the flushing? Like, did we flush it?
It was helpful. It's not fully considered flush because we weren't able to get the scouring that would be necessary, and that's what we're looking at for completion of this particular project. And it won't be system-wide, but it will be some of those areas that are our biggest concern for having sediment, so.
I just thought it might be possible that the work we did to mitigate this
It
could
certainly
also
helped.
create
Yeah.
help for the future.
Yeah, so we've been talking about it over the years. Dennis has been trying to find a way of getting that done, and that's where South Bow will help, and also some of these new technologies that we're looking at.
Yeah,
So fingers crossed that all lines up for us.
thank you.
Councillor Graham, did you have another question?
Yeah, I'll just add one more in here. Something, I was just struck that the timing of this one was challenging.
Yep.
We're in peak season, businesses are very busy. The disruption there was significant.
Yep.
Have we thought about when we would commission these sorts of things?
Not going to be before a long weekend.
Thank God.
Or Christmas Day, or like that, I've been around a long time, and that's one of the things that it always happens before something like that.
There's no
And
good time.
There
but-
never is, but we're certainly going to not relive that, so.
Okay. So we could commission these in shoulder seasons in the future?
Well, you can't do it in the winter, right?
Obviously,
Because, frozen water's a problem. But we want to get as much done as we can before, say, July, vacation season again. And we're hoping that that'll line up, and we've got enough information to hopefully recommission the South Bow in May, as long as we get the information we need, and the model is complete, and we're comfortable with that decision. But we would like to really get it all done by the end of the summer. But we can go into the fall if we need to for avoidance of more public disruption.
Thank you. I think that would be
Yeah.
greatly
Yeah,
appreciated.
nobody wants that again.
No, that was a high season, without a doubt. Thank you.
Not seeing any other questions, so Ms. Campbell, Mr. Visser, Mr. McKenzie, thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for all of your efforts, and to the town of Canmore as well, in working together to deal with this issue that nobody invited, but it was dealt with as fast as humanly possible. And so thank you for those efforts and for being with us today to share the findings of what you discovered during the investigation.
Thank you.
We'll now move to item D2, busking in Canmore. No, I don't think we need to. Ms.
Hello,
McLeod.
Mayor and Council. We'll wait for the presentation to.
Welcome.
Perfect, and I can just hit? Some kind of signal? Okay, so I'm here to provide council with a report on busking. Pre-2021, busking was not permitted in Canmore under the Traffic and Road Use Bylaw. So no person shall undertake any of the following activities on any portion of the highway or public places unless authorized by the land use bylaw as amended or by written permission. And busking was in that list, or is still in that list. And so we created a process under which busking would be permitted in Canmore. Permission was included as part of the business registry bylaw, and permits are issued with a set of conditions. And these conditions were developed in reviewing busking process in a number of different communities, such as Banff, Calgary, Granville Island, and others, to name a few. So just as a reminder that busking, they must obtain a business license, and we set the $35 as part of our micro licenses so that it aligns with what is currently in our system. And a micro license is for a business that makes less than $30,000 a year. That's the definition. And busking is permitted within pre-approved locations indicated on the map that is on the website, which is the Civic Center, Friendship Plaza, Riverside Park, and Elevation Place. And they could do so between May 1st and October 31st. No amplification can be used in a maximum of 2 hours per location, and this seemed to be the standard across the board. Buskers must demonstrate a reasonable degree of proficiency in their performance, and I will say, if you're in Granville Island, you have to do an audition, you have to be selected, and we thought that was, one, very labor intensive and also very prohibitive, and everybody's definition of what is proficient is maybe different, and there might be more grace if you were a junior performer, because it's also an opportunity to learn. And then the town did reserve the right to suspend or revoke busking permits if busker contravened the conditions of their permit or other town bylaws. So think about noise bylaws if you're playing outside of permitted times. Overall, busking was also not permitted if it was outside certain areas, certain restrictions. So COVID, although we approved the bylaw in April, busking wasn't actually permitted until June as COVID restrictions allowed for more gathering opportunities outdoors. So when we did launch, we marketed, we promoted, we had 4 applications, 3 of which paid for their licenses in Canmore. So we still had a lot of educating to do, our businesses. And, oh, you're so on it, Andrew, already on a new slide. So we had some educating to do to buskers who were not in the permitted areas and deal with that process. We had some pushback from Riverside Park residents who received 4 emails, mainly at that point around how would we permit busking if restrictions were in place, and we assured them that we would not be permitting unless the restrictions were put in place, and that we would follow up. So we sent at that time we sent a letter to all residents along that area, and we promised to follow up post-season with a survey so that they could provide feedback and we could take those learnings. Any complaints we did receive were related to buskers that were unlicensed, generally of questionable capacity, mainly when it came down to bagpiping or accordions. And then we had some interest for lowering the age of busking from our residents. So as we did the survey to Riverside Park residents, we only had 4 people respond. two of which indicated, actually no one indicated that they even noticed buskers. One said one, but nobody indicated negative impact. Two residents indicated they didn't want busking, one in their backyard or in parks at all. And I will say it's hard to see what the impact was because we only had 3 permitted buskers because of the lateness in the season of the program. However, with such low participation, we are proposing to go kind of status quo this year with a few changes based on some of the feedback that we've received, some tweaks from municipal enforcement in that space. So increase busking times from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., given that there's more vibrancy still in the downtown core in those areas, with the exception of Riverside Park, given that residents don't want to be impacted, but it is a public park and public land and can be booked and as such. We are proposing to run the program during the same time frame as the pedestrian zone, as well as the food trucks, just create some consistency in that space. And because of the impact of instruments such as bagpipes, trumpets, and accordions, limit wear. So we're not saying to get rid of it altogether, but maybe limit it to a space that has less residential in their area and the impact on that. So that's the proposed shift that we're moving forward. I will say these are permitting conditions, so it's not a bylaw or a policy that would normally come to council, so within administrative purview. We're also not proposing to change the current locations, and I will flag that any other areas can apply to become a busking location. So should Main Street businesses want more vibrancy, they can submit a request for the town to increase, to add that as a location to that area. So just to be clear, we're not saying Main Street, we're saying we want some business support in having buskers in front of their property. So that is my presentation to council, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. McClett, for that update. Looking to council, as to any questions, Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, President McClett. Congratulations on your appointment, by the way. I had some feedback from people, from elected officials from other communities, and they were really happy to see you in that space. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So busking in particular is specific to performing for donations.
Correct.
So what stops somebody from standing in the middle of Riverside Park, not soliciting donations, and playing any instrument they please, which I think we've all heard. There's the trumpeter that, I haven't heard him in the last few years. There used to be somebody that would practice their trumpet right at Riverside Park or right along the river, and I think it was actually a teenage kid. Anyways, but what stops anybody from doing that?
Having had a kid who played trumpet, I can appreciate that must have been interesting. I would say nothing other than if they play outside of our noise,
noise
bylaw.
That's the only thing that
So
applies,
if they're just playing for the sake of playing, they have a family picnic and they pull out a guitar,
right.
Nothing
Okay.
that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I don't
I'm looking at
think so.
the left side.
Mr. McCallum.
Depending on the activity, it might violate the parks bylaw. So there's pieces in there around operating an amplifier or loudspeaker device, public demonstration, likely to cause a public gathering, etc. So that could.
Right, but so if they're not amplified though, they're good to go pretty much.
I mean, if it's turning into an event that's unpermitted, then.
I suppose. What stops somebody from standing on their own property that buffers the park and doing the exact same thing? Anyways, I just was curious if it was really about the voluntary donation piece that really sets it apart in terms of, and that totally seems
for
that
this
way.
process, yes.
Absolutely.
I cannot speak to parks bylaw.
All right.
Mr. McKay is far more versed in that space than I am.
That was my only question. Thank you so much.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you for this. So I think I heard you mention that council really doesn't have input on this.
So
policy?
we looked at the time of what was the better process, bylaw, and it was, under direction of the clerk, thought that putting permitting conditions on was the way to go. So conditions are, I think, in the administrative purview, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
Dr.
just
Cottle?
for clarity, previous council did give direction on this. It's already been voted on. Ms. McLeod is just closing the loop and updating this council on the pilot. It's already been approved by council.
Okay. So if we did want it to come back, we could request that it come back.
Yeah, you would, well, there's multiple ways to request to come back. You can make a request to the Agenda Review Committee. That's probably the best way. After having a discussion with Dr. Cottle or one of the GMs and make sure
Doctors
that
and presidents, man, we are privileged around here, aren't we?
Yeah, it can come back, but there has to be some direction given or an item received. It's not going to come back
Without,
just on its own without something like that causing it.
doesn't just pop up in the agenda. Thing. I love busking. I think busking adds vibrancy and, you know, coming out of the pandemic, going back to a pedestrian zone, introducing of paid parking. I love seeing buskers around. I love seeing them on the corners. I know that there are a few that people don't appreciate, and that's art sometimes. So I think everything we can do to encourage buskers in as many locations as possible, I would be supportive of. The age restrictions and those things, I love seeing young kids out there playing fiddles and paying for their music lessons that are really expensive. I like seeing those things. So I was disappointed to see the age restrictions in here. I would love to see buskers in our downtown at some point in time. And I'm wondering, did we talk to, like we talked to downtown businesses, did we talk to the performance arts industry and get their feedback? I'm wondering, why did we only end up with 3 applications? All the talented artists in this town, we ended up with 3 applications.
So some of the restrictions around 3 applications is the use of amplification. And so we did work with Folkfest to look at a pop-up stage. They ended up backing away from that. And that would then be under an event permit to allow for amplification. So we might see that this year to have a pop-up stage and Folkfest participants or those moving up in those areas come and perform on that, but that's then under an event permit because amplification adds a level of engagement to your surrounding community. That was one of the restrictions, and the lateness, right? It was June before COVID restrictions allowed us to even put that out there. So some, buskers were had come through the community at that time. Our hope is we're seeing applications come in now already because the application process is open. It just has then a date on when those permits are for, so when they can perform based on that. So hopefully we'll see more this year. I agree with you. I'm a big lover of buskers and performance. Would love to see more, and I would love to see other locations request to be that space, but I can recognize that if you're running a business, that sometimes that might be challenging depending on who is in that space.
I run a business that works on silence, so I get the limitations sometimes or the inconvenience.
I was going to ask, would you want one outside of yours? But
well, sometimes I go outside my door and play guitar, although, not a dime has come my way, just so I don't end up with I was just going to say that, of all the industries that were really hard hit, performance arts over the past 2 years has been, devastated. We outlawed singing for the most part, and I just think that we should be doing everything we can to encourage those people to add the vibrancy to our town that they can bring.
So that's exactly what I see this as being, since we had no busking, and now there's busking, and now there's some amendments being made, and if it's catches on and there's more permits, then you might see more of it. If you're talking to your fellow business colleagues and say, hey, wouldn't it be good to have this as a site? And you could certainly put it into the town as a request. But I see this as a movement up as opposed to a clamping down. You know, so.
Certainly a move in the right direction. I would love to see us move farther that way.
Councillor Ma.
Thank you for your presentation, President McLeod. So we had a bit of an email correspondence earlier, and you're saying if Main Street businesses would like to see more busking on the Main Street area, because, you know, hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to be a vibrant downtown this summer, and they can request to the town to have a permittable location. How does that work exactly? Is it like, if say I had a business on the Main Street, I need to talk to my 2 neighboring businesses, or like the whole street? Or
Not the whole street. I would say if you have engaged your neighboring businesses and there's some level of support, specifically because the area, the parking areas are great locations to do so. You can then send an email into the town. I wouldn't go further than your neighboring businesses.
Okay, so that would be like a good guideline.
It just gets more complicated then, yeah.
Okay, all right. And if we were to do, explore this potential down the road of, say, like I know currently we have it that if you can busk at 16, at the age of 16 right now in town of Canmore, but a parent or an adult has to sign your thing. I'd be interested to see what my counselor's appetite would be if, say, there was younger people, say 12 to 15, that they could also perform in busk, but maybe if an adult was present at the same time. So I'll see, maybe we'll bring that forward on a future agenda. Okay.
I'm amenable to anything in that space.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Faubert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Ms. McLeod, for your presentation and your hard work on creating this busking permit conditions and this program. I share my colleagues' excitement because I know COVID's still happening, but I feel like we're in a space where we can start moving forward with some of the things that we put on hold or we put to the side or we couldn't actually really evaluate properly as a result of the conditions we were in. And I think busking is one of them, especially given this progress we made on pedestrianizing Main Street through the pandemic. I think a lot of things are aligning around our vibrancy downtown, and busking really adds to that. One thing I'll note too, when I was in Whistler, part of their resort municipality money, they used some for activation. So it wasn't people busking, there was actual local musicians would be performing in the village, and that money came from that tourism support. So we're doing the work now, and sometime in the future it might be different, but I think it's really great that we're providing this opportunity. My only 2 feedbacks, and I have no questions, I apologize, is along the lines of the age restriction. And I think that that's definitely an area we could explore further. My one hesitation is working alone, like busking is a work alone scenario. Children under 16 on their own, performing in a public space, like Councillor Ma said, parent might need to be present, and that might not necessarily work, but I think 16, that's when you kind of start working, when you're out there and you really have that independence to learn to perhaps handle an audience on your own. And then the merchandise, the limitation on selling merchandise, that could be something that, I'm not sure if that was a COVID restriction in terms of exchanging money and touch points, but.
Yeah, when we researched this at the time, that was the standard, that sales of merchandise weren't. When looking in response to the question I received prior to the council meeting, a number of do allow sales of your own CD, and you have to prove that it's your own work and not somebody else. Merchandise, as in swag, generally not permitted in the communities I looked at. Yeah. Because again, you're there to perform, you're soliciting money as a result of that piece. If you're really talented, somebody might buy your music, and how great would that be?
And that's where I think it would be a good to to the music, right? If you're sharing that music and someone wants to take it and enjoy it, there's a benefit to both in that scenario. And it's not like you got all your t-shirts and your stickers and your keychains out there. I had a question popped up in my head and then I completely, now it's gone. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Faubert. And I don't see any other questions, so thank you, Ms. McClett. As you're talking, I am mindful of many years ago, Ms. Bartolome was involved in a street performers festival, and I would love for something like that. I had a lot of fun actually doing some of the performing in that, and it was great. And,
yeah, I know the BIA is looking at summer activation and what that might look like, and who knows, maybe paid street performers are part of that that process. But work is being done in that space.
Great, thank you. Moving to item D3, Adaptation, Resilience Training, Intern Report, Natural Assets and Climate Change Adaptation. And that is a $1 million title there, right there. Mr. Como.
Good afternoon again, members of council. So this presentation is we wanted to provide council with a summary of our natural assets and climate change adaptation research, some of the recommendations that were identified by the University of Alberta's Adaptive Resilience internship program. So we were able to have someone come and work for us at actually no cost to the organization. So we want to take full advantage of that. He's on the computer right now. And but before we begin the presentation, I just wanted to I believe Ms. Caitlin Van Gaal is, I wanted to introduce her. Is she there? Okay. All right. So she's our new Supervisor of Environment and Sustainability. She joined the town of Canmore back at the end of January, so she's been with us just less than 3 months. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here today, so she's visiting family in PEI, so she's there to support the presentation. She comes to us from the city of Spruce Grove, and she's quite excited to be here, and she's not fictitious. At some point, when it's she has another agenda item here, we'll do a formal introduction to council. That said, I also wanted to recognize Miss Amy Fournier is also here to support the presentation. She's real. She's right here, and she'll probably be answering any questions that maybe perhaps our presenter can't respond to. And then obviously I would like to introduce Joshua Balick, who comes from us graduated last year from the University of Alberta and a Bachelor of Science degree in Environment and Conservation Sciences with a major in Environmental Economics and Policy. He's been doing the research for our sustainability team since last September. He's here today, remotely as well. It just made sense because he's actually not been working in Canmore. He's been working where he lives, and provide a summary of his research, and which is aimed to basically answer 2 questions. The first is whether the town should be looking at undertaking a natural asset strategy, and if so, what it would take to create one. And secondly, whether the town should consider a refresh to its existing climate change, adaptation, and resilience plan. So 2 big questions, and with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Balick.
Great. Well, Mr. Balick, welcome to council, and I'll just take a moment to welcome Ms. Van Gaal to the town of Canmore. And Ms. Fournier, welcome to all of you to council today, and please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Crosser and council, for allowing me to present today. As Mr. Como mentioned, my name is Josh Balick. I am the Adaptation Resilience Training, or Arts Intern, for the town of Canmore. Today I'm here to provide you with a summary of the research that I conducted for the town through the Art Internship Program. So what is the Art Program? I'm fortunate enough to have found this internship with the town through the Art Program, which is a cost-shared initiative through Natural Resources Canada and Alberta Environment and Parks. The main objective of the program is to match recent or upcoming graduates with 8-month internship placements to help develop the climate change adaptation capacity of municipalities and other organizations throughout Alberta. Town staff applied to the ART program so that I could assist the town in gaining a better understanding of 2 subject areas of interest, those being natural asset management and valuation and climate change adaptation. With each subject area, I'll start by introducing each topic and then diving into a brief overview of my research before providing my recommended next steps that the town could take to implement this research. I'll start with natural asset management and valuation and end with climate change adaptation. I'll take questions at the end of each part of this presentation, so if it's not too much trouble, please hold your questions until then, and myself or someone else from the sustainability team would be happy to answer any questions you may have. So jumping right in with natural assets, and you're all probably wondering, what are natural assets? Well, natural assets are naturally occurring features of the environment, such as trees, wetlands, creeks, grasslands, and a whole host of other natural features. And what makes these natural features an asset is that through their normal functioning within an ecosystem, they provide a multitude of beneficial ecosystem services. So for example, a wetland functioning as a wetland should provides water quality regulation, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, as well as wildlife habitat and possible recreation opportunities. Compared to gray or engineered infrastructure, which typically only serves one purpose, this flexibility in terms of the number of services that natural assets provide really sets them apart. This flexibility in turn also makes natural assets extremely difficult to replace if a viable option for replacement doesn't already exist. So for example, if you were to drain a wetland and convert its land to another use, there's essentially nothing that could replace all the services that a wetland provides. In keeping with the wetland example, a stormwater pond meant to replace a wetland would only be able to replace the flood mitigation aspect of a wetland at the expense of losing all the other services that a wetland provides. Even if there is a replacement option, it is often the case that it is extremely costly to replace natural assets. Adding on to that, compared to gray infrastructure, which requires significant investment to construct and maintain, natural assets generally require very little in the way of maintenance. So you may be asking yourselves, why does it matter if natural assets are difficult to replace? Natural assets haven't exactly disappeared and they don't seem to be going anywhere. So why should we think any differently now? While that may be true, there are 2 main threats to the existence of natural assets, those being climate change and land development. With land development throughout North America and the rest of the world, natural assets may not be considered to have any value throughout the development process, and as such, they're likely to get removed altogether. And with climate change, overall, there is increased pressure being placed on natural systems as a whole, with hotter temperatures, more extreme weather events, and increased prevalence of disease and invasive species, all having detrimental effects on natural assets. So for example, as we experience warmer temperatures throughout the year, the spread of mountain pine beetle has become more prominent and is causing more damage to our forests. This is where natural asset management and valuation comes into play. Natural asset management and valuation is a relatively new concept within Canada, especially within Alberta. But within the last 10 years or so, it has really started to become a more common practice among a number of leading Canadian municipalities. The aim of natural asset management and valuation is to ensure the ongoing management and protection of natural assets and the services that they provide, which is accomplished by placing a dollar value on these services and by extension, the asset itself. Several communities from across Canada have in one way or another done this, including the town of Okotoks, the cities of Calgary, Saskatoon, and Nanaimo, along with the long list of municipalities listed in the image on the slide, as well as some others that aren't listed here. The values next to each municipality listed in the bullets here indicate the value of natural assets within that municipality and whether this included all natural assets within that municipality or whether it included a smaller subset of natural assets. Canmore actually has conducted similar work to natural asset management with the Urban Forest Management Plan, in which a small subset of town-owned and managed trees were valued at $249 million. This plan only included a small subset of trees within Canmore and did not include any other types of natural assets. So through my research, I found that there are two main ways that this type of plan is developed that are applicable at the municipal level. The first approach, which was used and developed by a consultant group in the creation of the Town of Okotoks Natural Asset Plan, is to identify what specific assets you're interested in managing, map them, determine the condition and services they provide, and then each asset is assigned a dollar value based on its condition and service level. As all this information is gathered, it's also necessary to compile all this info into an inventory, which can then be integrated with whatever asset management software or registry the town currently has. It's worth mentioning that the Town of Okotoks received national recognition for their natural asset work, which demonstrates the quality of the approach taken there. The other approach, which was developed by the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, is to simply measure the services provided by a natural asset and then estimate the cost of infrastructure required to replace the same level of service provided by the natural asset. That estimated cost is then assigned as the value of the natural asset. Typically, MNAI has limited the application of their valuation process to stormwater management or flood mitigation services. Overall, in reviewing these processes, what I found is that if a municipality wants this sort of plan to have a meaningful impact, a natural asset inventory with information concerning the asset's value, location, size, and other relevant information must be included in the creation of a natural asset management and valuation plan. So creating a natural asset plan infers several benefits. First off, it ensures that natural assets will be proactively managed, thereby mitigating the risks to them. It's also far more cost effective to manage and take care of your natural assets than to let them fall into disarray and potentially lose all the services that they provide and have to replace them, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be very costly or next to impossible to do. Having a plan of this nature also demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship by actively considering the town's dependence and impacts on natural assets. And lastly, as one might guess, having a plan of this nature also supports a more climate resilient community. Natural assets themselves are an incredible tool in supporting a climate resilient community as they provide a range of services that help communities both adapt to and mitigate climate change at a fraction of the cost of building and maintaining green infrastructure. Alternatively, without a natural asset plan and inventory and an understanding of the services provided by natural assets, there are several risks to not completing this work. So as I mentioned earlier, as climate change becomes more severe, we're at risk of losing natural assets or having their condition and ecosystem services become degraded. Without a natural asset plan and inventory, it's very difficult to fully comprehend what climate change might actually mean for Canmore and what effect climate change may have on our natural assets. And keeping with climate change, natural assets provide climate change mitigation benefits such as carbon sequestration and urban heat island mitigation. To date, we haven't been able to value or quantify these ecosystem services and how they align to our other mitigation efforts or understand potential greenhouse gas implications of losing natural assets. So again, without a natural asset plan, it's very difficult to quantify what this impact might be. Without a natural asset plan, we also risk limiting our knowledge of the value of economic development and tourism in Canmore. More so than other municipalities, Canmore's natural assets make the town the destination that it is. This work could provide a better understanding of that value and the potential economic risks to not proactively managing natural assets. And lastly, without a natural asset plan, we may be limiting the effectiveness of future land management. There may be upcoming strategic plans, capital projects, or developments that could be informed by a natural asset inventory and valuation. So for example, this work could be integrated with a future update to the existing stormwater management plan to gain a better understanding of our natural flood mitigation measures. In terms of specific applications that this sort of plan with an associated inventory could have, it mainly supports decision-making capacity in a few respects. These include the monitoring and assessment of management policy outcomes, basically seeing what specific actions within the town are having on natural assets. Another application could be the implementation of environmental management instruments, such as the establishment of a conservation easement or directive, or the establishment of an environmental reserve. And lastly, natural asset management also has the potential to inform land use planning. This use in particular has already been applied by the town of Okotoks and provides us with two examples. The first example of informed land use planning that comes from Okotoks is in the planning of a biking trail through the river valley. So instead of taking the trail through an area which contained a lot of high-value assets that would be lost, as represented by the red line, they instead opted for an alternative route that minimized the loss in services provided by natural assets, as represented by the blue line. It's important to note that the illustrations in the slide are just for the sake of visualizing the example and is likely not indicative of where this actually took place. Another example from Okotoks is in their assessment of area structure or development plans. During the area structure plan and development permit process, internal staff can overlay their natural asset inventory onto development plans so they can see what natural assets will be impacted and what ecosystem service benefits may be lost in the development process. Okotoks' planning process also includes a requirement for developers to provide a biophysical assessment of the proposed area. Staff in Okotoks can now compare these assessments with the town's inventory and valuation, which may identify potential gaps. So for example, say a developer wants to drain a wetland that provides X amount of flood mitigation or stormwater management services, and now gives Okotoks the ability to say, hey, this wetland is actually valuable, and by keeping it, you'll actually save on having to replace those services down the line. So through this research, I've identified the following next steps that the town could take towards creating a natural asset plan of its own. To start, it is important to reach a consensus among internal staff as to what we want to get out of a plan of this nature. In particular, it will be important to agree upon the services and assets that the town is interested in managing and valuing, as well as the specific long-term rationale for the use of the plan. Next, I recommend following a similar approach to that used in Okotoks. Overall, that approach offers more flexibility, is feasible in terms of staff commitment requirements, and the way in which the work was conducted makes sense and stacks up against other approaches to natural asset management. Regardless of the approach the town decides to take, it's very important to have all the data and imagery related to natural assets ready to be handed over to consultants that will conduct this work. So compiling all this information will help the process. The town is conducting an aerial imagery update later this summer, so after that is complete, this step could be done. And lastly, if the town does in fact create a natural asset plan of some sort, it is critical that a natural asset inventory is created and integrated with the town's current asset register, so they can be managed alongside the town's other assets. That concludes the first half of my presentation. If there are any questions about natural assets, myself and the rest of the sustainability team would be happy to take them now before moving on.
Thanks, Mr. Valek. And I appreciate that you've just gone through a large number of potential benefits and uses. I'm trying to grasp what the actual, if the town of Canmore was to embark on engaging in natural asset management and valuation, what's the actual difference that we would see, given that we already engage in certain protective zonings, we require environmental impact statements, there's corridors, habitat patches. So what's the add-on to that sort of work, or does it replace some of that work?
I don't think it. Thank you, Mayor Krasser, for your question. I don't think it would replace any of those instruments, but it is certainly an add-on. And like I said in my presentation, without knowing the condition of your natural assets, which is part of a plan of this nature, you can't really start to manage them and understand whether or not they're at risk of being lost, potentially.
Right. So just to follow up then, I would think, and in seeing the map in Okotoks, it seems like there's certain areas that are designated with a higher percentage of value or importance. And so would there be a difference, like if there's some development that's happening on Bow Valley Trail, Valley Bottom, near the highway and everything, and there's a bunch of trees that have to be removed. Is something like this impact the ability of that sort of development, as opposed to protecting assets and natural resources that are, part of wildlife connectivity and that sort of thing? Does every tree become a natural asset that then it's an extra process, and does it actually cause some development that is needed to not happen?
No, by no means is this a plan that will completely restrict development. It can more so be used as a tool to help ensure that the development process isn't overlooking services that are essential to the town. So, like I mentioned, with the example of wetland, if you were to drain a wetland in an area that is to be developed, but that wetland is already providing, $40 million in flood mitigation services, and a developer removes that wetland, they're eventually going to have to replace that level of service so that their future development isn't perpetually flooded. So in keeping the wetland there and preserving natural assets as they are, that this plan can help with that.
So this provides presumably that sort of thing would be brought out in an environmental impact statement. So this provides even greater context and perhaps, puts a number to it that gives it a relative importance. Yeah. Mr. Coleman.
Yeah. And maybe I would just add, Mayor Krauser, just to kind of help, I think it's just, I would see it more as one more tool in the toolbox in decision-making when we receive applications, for example. And, for example, we did the urban forest management plan. It identified that the value of our trees currently sit at $250 million. And one of the recommendations that came out of that was to create a tree protection bylaw, which we're putting into place, and I think we've had some really good success there, where in particular with public trees, which have significant benefit that were identified in the UFMP, is when someone wants to change their driveway, for example, but now there's considerations that, well, maybe I won't because I have to cut down a number of public trees, assigns a value to it, and they actually have to compensate for that with the intention that it would feed a reserve that could use to provide or plant trees in another location. So I think, I don't know if that helps, Mayor Krauser, but it's mostly about another toolbox that we would use when we receive applications and making decisions. And I think having this level of information, we may be making better decisions.
Great. Well, thank you. I find it very interesting. I just was trying to get a sense of where it fits in the order of the way we do things. Councillor Ma.
Thank you for your presentation so far, Mr. Ballack. Is this a sort of fact-finding information piece stuff, if we start managing these assets this way, that can help inform how we calculate off-site levies and such? Is this has that been done in the, I'm just trying to understand more of how this application can be used.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I'll let Andreas take this one.
So, Councillor Ma, if you could, you're thinking beyond the traditional way of dealing, putting in place an off-site levy bylaw.
I support the idea of where we're going with this. Is this a sort of information pieces that would inform other things we do, such as our off-site levies and all that such?
Well, that's an interesting idea. It's assigning a value to it, and if it needs to be removed, it is off-site. Mm-hmm. Because we would have to think through that a little bit more to
yeah, there's lots of interesting pieces
sure.
to it, so I was trying to understand. Yeah.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, the MGA does dictate, and you're right, thank you, that it is quite prescriptive, and it's limited to constructed assets.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Councillor Faubert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Ballack. I'm curious, how does a natural asset management tool look at private versus public property? I know our urban forest management plan looked at trees on public property or trees on provincial property that the town managed, therefore that was within their jurisdiction. But in terms of this type of framework, on the spinning wheel, for example, there was a golf course photo, but that would have been, could be a private development land. So I'm just kind of curious whether it's all the same and that gives us an even playing field for making decisions, or now I'm answering your question and I will stop talking.
No, thank you for your question. As from what I've seen through the town of Okotoks, as well as other management plans through my research, it really, you can include private and public lands in the same plan, but when it comes time to bring that information forward, keeping the valuation of private lands confidential is typically how it's done.
Great, thank you. Councillor Graham?
Yeah, I think this is just a comment more than anything. I remember about a year ago, I watched a video of a town in Oregon, I think it was, that placed value on private property, natural assets, trees. This was a documentary on old growth forests, and this town had many large trees in there on private land. And a developer wanted to redevelop his land, and the community had some feedback as to whether those trees should stay or not. And I wonder if this plan incorporates some of those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, certainly it could inform decisions on private land. Ultimately, it's up to the intended use of the plan as to whether or not that's the direction that the town wants to take with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, and seeing no other questions, please proceed with the next part of your presentation.
All right, so moving on to the second part of my research on climate change adaptation. So as we all know, climate change is having significant impacts all across Canada with more frequent extreme weather events such as flooding, wildfires, drought, extreme storms, the list goes on. You don't have to look too far into the past to see examples of these impacts with flooding in southern BC last fall, extreme heat and wildfire from last summer, both causing significant damage to communities and public infrastructure. For Canmore in particular, we're predicted to have warmer temperatures across all seasons, more precipitation in the fall, winter, and spring, and less in the summer, and in general, more severe weather-related events. Climate change is no longer some distant possibility. It's here now, and there's a need to act quickly in order to prevent its worst impacts. The two main ways in which we as human beings are acting to combat climate change is through mitigation and adaptation. So just to review quickly, climate change adaptation consists of the actions aimed at managing the impacts of climate change, such as extreme heat, wildfire, and flooding. This differs from climate change mitigation, which are actions meant to reduce emissions that cause climate change. The formal way in which communities go about climate change adaptation is to create climate change adaptation plans with the objective of implementing adaptation actions to manage climate risks deemed most important to the community. The town does have its own climate change adaptation plan from 2016, which identified 51 actions that the town could take to mitigate the risks deemed most significant to Canmore, which included wildfire, flooding from both steep creeks and the river, stormwater overflow, and extreme wind, among a few others. Out of the 51 actions listed in the plan, the town has obtained partial implementation of such actions, with 22% of actions being deemed complete, 43% partially completed or implemented on an ongoing basis, and 35% which have not yet been implemented. As was the case with my research on natural assets, I sought out what was out there in terms of climate adaptation planning frameworks, in particular what was being used by other Canadian municipalities. As you'd expect, all the major cities within Canada have a climate adaptation plan of some sort. However, they generally all follow one of two adaptation planning frameworks. The most widely used adaptation planning framework by far, with over 77 Canadian communities using it, is the ICLEI-BARC framework. And the other main framework, which has been more widely adopted within Alberta, is All One Sky's Climate Resilience Express. This framework was used by the town in creating the current 2016 adaptation plan, but they've since updated their process slightly. In general, how adaptation plans are developed is pretty similar no matter what framework you're using. This is due to the fact that at the end of the day, a climate change adaptation plan is just a structured vulnerability and risk assessment process that is specifically geared towards managing the risks that come with climate change. In reviewing both ICLEI-BARC and Climate Resilience Express and the adaptation plans from other municipalities that were created using these frameworks, this process always starts with engaging stakeholders in order to define the scope of the plan and identify all the climate hazards that are set to have some sort of impact on the community going forward. From there, each hazard is assessed through a risk assessment process. And then based on the results of this risk assessment process, the stakeholders then draft adaptation actions to deal with the risks deemed most important to the community. Once all the potential adaptation actions have been drafted, it's then necessary to agree upon a process in which it would be possible to monitor implementation and to agree upon a time frame within which the plan should be updated. So part of my process with this portion of my research was to identify the areas in which the town's current adaptation plan could be updated when compared to the practices of other leading municipalities. Overall, the town did do a great job in following a very structured process, getting a whole host of adaptation actions out of that. However, in conducting my review of the town's current adaptation plan, there were a few areas that could be refreshed. The first thing that I noticed is that the current version of the plan is past threshold for its regular update, which is supposed to occur every 5 years, according to the plan itself. The plan wasn't updated within the 5-year timeframe due to the COVID-19 pandemic and limited time and resources to take on such a large task. I was brought on with the town so that I could assist in reviewing the plan and make recommendations for its update. Another note that ties in with the first point is that the plan does not include any sort of monitoring and review process, which when compared to the adaptation plans of other Canadian municipalities is something that can be included and can be beneficial in keeping you on track with your adaptation goals. And lastly, the climate projection data used in the creation of the plan has likely surpassed its usefulness. And what I mean by this is that since 2016, climate science has progressed with more powerful climate models able to yield better results for a wider range of climate variables. So sticking with the climate projection data used in the 2016 plan would limit the adaptation planning process, which is so heavily dependent on the use of climate projection data. So going forward, if the town decides to update the climate adaptation plan, my specific recommendations for updating the current adaptation plan are to include a more robust monitoring and review process to ensure you're staying on track with your adaptation goals, to include Indigenous consultation throughout the stakeholder engagement process, to utilize an equity lens to ensure vulnerable populations are considered throughout the planning process, and to update the source of climate projection data to ensure that the planning process is based on the most up-to-date information. That concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mayor Krausert and Council, for giving me the opportunity to present today. Is there any final questions? I'd be happy to take them now.
Thank you for your presentation. Looking to Council to see if there are any questions. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could go back to the last slide, the slide before questions. Please. Magic word. The one before that.
The one before this?
Yeah, sorry. Oh no, go forward. Yeah. So equity lens. Could you speak more about what you mean by that, please?
Yeah, so climate change is predicted to have harsher impacts on our historically disadvantaged populations, like racialized communities, low-income communities. So developing this plan with those populations in mind is something that should be considered going forward. So ensuring that they're engaged throughout the planning process and ensuring that the eventual adaptation actions that come out of this plan are geared towards those populations and prioritize them because they're the ones that are least able to deal with the impacts of climate change.
I turned it off beforehand. Could you, is there a line that could be drawn between what you're speaking of and, what do they call it? Is it energy poverty? Is that, I'm getting a nod in front of me by your boss. Can somebody speak a bit more about
Ms. Fournier
that?
could probably.
I can take that one. Yeah, in energy poverty, it's a newer concept. So it just describes people who are challenged to pay their bills, their energy bills. So it's someone who may be forced to make a decision, do I buy groceries or do I pay my electricity bill? So it's a concept that is being used now in climate mitigation and climate adaptation planning. So I guess to answer your question, energy poverty, yes, that could be used. Yeah. Mm-hmm. For sure. I think with energy poverty, that would also come into play with our climate change mitigation planning, perhaps more so than climate change adaptation planning. And I think, just as an example, that the best practice is to engage more lower income or vulnerable populations or populations that typically get left out of planning processes in adaptation planning because they are likely to experience more of the impacts. So just as a tangible example, heat domes, heat domes in the future. So someone who lives in a very small apartment is going to experience a heat dome much differently than people who live in large houses on leafy streets that have basements that can escape from the heat or can get in their cars and drive somewhere that's cooler and not experiencing that. So we want to make sure that if we're planning how we deal with heat domes, that we are engaging those people who would experience that much more acutely.
So when we're looking at how we build our homes, would we be looking at how we reinforce, say, our basements for basement suites? So when I think about the 2013 flood, a lot of people literally, like physically, were flushed out of their basement suite. And so those are folks that are at the lower end generally of the economic spectrum. And I think we actually didn't really talk about it much in our community. And was actually part of the piece that sort of fed into our affordability challenges a few years out after that, because there was an actual lack of basement suites as a result of the flood.
Yeah, I think that's another great example.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I just had an aha and I thought I'd ask.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Malik, for all of the work that you've done here and for this presentation today.
Thank you, Mayor Krauser and Council.
With that, I'm going to call a break, and we will resume at 3:15. Yep. Okay, and we're back. We'll now move on to item D4, Elk Run Boulevard Functional Design Report. Mr. Asarte. Welcome to council.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'll provide a brief intro. Again, today I'm joined by Trevor Reeder remotely. So I'll provide a brief intro for Mr. Reeder's presentation and then turn it over to him. Today's presentation, it's focused on two key corridors connecting the Cougar Creek community, Elk Run industrial area, as well as the various commercial, residential, municipal facilities in the area. So that's Elk Run Boulevard and Glacier Drive. Though the timing of this project, it's really related to recommendations for road rehabilitation. And with that comes a look at subsurface utilities. So there's some utility work that also needs to be done. And so you're going to be digging up the street. And these really are opportunities to look at other requirements. So in this area, there's a growing need and demand to address connectivity. It has quite limited connectivity right now, to address safety and accessibility. The project is actually an important one. It may not be what you would look at as a priority if you were just simply focused on transportation, but it's an important one in the context of our overall plans and looking forward to supporting in achieving our 2030 transportation goals. So what we'll see discussed is around this complete street improvement, providing an opportunity to address a number of strategies in the transportation plan. And these include the need for safe paths and sidewalks for people walking and cycling, to address safety issues at intersections and crosswalks, to right-size the road for the classification and associated speed limits, and to consider parking use and as well as integrating transit, which didn't exist when the community was developed out. So just putting this into context for the number of complete street projects we are focused on at the time, or at present, we have a number on the go for which we're bringing updates to council. Last month we talked about the Bow River West pathway. Next month we'll be bringing forward updates on TP Town and Bow Valley Trail, work that's been happening around concept design, as well as to outline next steps in that project and in those areas. As these projects move forward, we're starting also to turn our attention to chartering and scoping for the next phase of work on Railway Avenue, and you'll recall we have a project in the work plan to get started on that. So we'll be back to council with updates for that project a little later in the year. And so that's it for the intro. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Reeder.
Great. Welcome to council, Mr. Reeder.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Shows up well, does it?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. As Andy said, my name's Trevor. It's good to see you all again. We recently finalized a high-level planning memo focused on Elk Run Boulevard and Glacier Drive. The planning memo considered a place and flow exercise to identify deficient street level functionality from the perspective of various users, transit users, cyclists, pedestrians, and drivers. It included a functional review, which built upon the place and flow results combined with traffic volume data to make recommendations for street classification and cross sections. And it included a network review to evaluate overall active network connectivity, considering origins, destinations, desire lines, providing recommendations for new and future infrastructure and connectivity improvements. The planning memo forms the basis for further conceptual development and design work, which will be completed this summer in order to support a capital project and budget approval proposal for the fall, which would lead us into detailed design and construction. So Elkron Boulevard and Glacier Drive were initially constructed in the 80s and 90s. Minor life cycle maintenance has been completed since then, and town policy around transportation particularly and engineering design standards have changed very significantly since then. Corridor, like Andy mentioned, requires the replacement of some deep utility work and also some surface life cycle pavement rehabilitation work. And this provides us a great opportunity to introduce some safety and accessibility improvements throughout the corridor and to bring these roadways into alignment with modern town policy and design standards. So the focus of our initial work is going to be to gather the conceptual design basis, complete an initial round of public engagement, and provide some preliminary design and estimates to inform future detailed design, tender, and construction work. The deep utility scope includes a sanitary force main that runs under the eastern half of Glacier Drive and the southern portion of Elkron Boulevard. This was identified by EPCOR due to historical repair work and regular inspection activities. Right now, Public Works is completing the 2022 Utility Master Plan, and we may see additional deep utility scope that comes out of that, depending on what the findings are. Pavement condition. Significant portions of this corridor have been identified for rehabilitation in our 10-year maintenance plan from the town's 2016 pavement condition survey. Elkron Boulevard is experiencing a significant amount of cracking, especially the northern section between Glacier and Benchlands. Throughout the whole corridor, though, there are localized signs of deterioration that we need to address. So completing a comprehensive surface works and cross-section improvement project on this entire corridor is intended to prolong the life of these assets, improve maintenance efficiency, and prevent further structural degradation. So Glacier Drive. Glacier Drive was constructed under historic Town of Canmore collector standards. It's 12 meters wide, typically has parking on both sides, experiences a significant amount of commercial and industrial use. It has a quite narrow sidewalk just on one side, and it has absolutely no marked cycle facilities. Upgrading Glacier to modern collector standards would see us remove some parking, provide improvements to active transportation facilities and accessibility, complete some intersection improvements, especially updated pedestrian crossings, consider some landscaping enhancements, and provide improved efficiency for maintenance and especially snow and ice control. Elkron Boulevard was constructed under historic town arterial standards. It's generally about 15 meters wide throughout the length. Preliminary functional review from our planning study recommended modifying the classification to a modern collector for the northern portion from Glacier to Benchlands and to a modern arterial with parking for the southern portion from Glacier to the 1A highway. So the northern portion has a sidewalk, non-separated cycle lane on the west side, and parking along most of the east side and some intermittent unmaintained trails. Pedestrian crossings in general are pretty long and unsignalized. Some of our needed crossings are missing, and some of our other existing crossings are poorly located. Southern portion has parking on both sides and really no pedestrian or cycle facilities to speak of. It sees a lot of commercial and industrial traffic. So targeted improvements to Elkron Boulevard would probably see a narrower roadway, the installation of new active transportation facilities in the southern portion, sidewalks and cycle facilities, improvements to the active transportation facilities and accessibility throughout the full length, some new and realignment of pedestrian crossings, intersection improvements, especially pedestrian crossing enhancements, consideration for landscaping enhancements, and improved efficiency for maintenance and especially snow and ice control. All of these things ultimately lead us to safety and accessibility. So the 2018 ITP speaks to Glacier and Elk Run. Glacier Drive is identified as a future dedicated cycle facility, and Elk Run Boulevard is identified for shared use paths and complete streets. Existing sidewalks and crosswalks within the corridor are shown in the image on the right. There's significant gaps in the active infrastructure along this corridor. With the exception of the sidewalks and a non-separated cycle lane on southbound Elk Run Boulevard, other dedicated active modes infrastructure just doesn't exist. Despite that, the Strava heat maps on the screen show cycle and pedestrian volumes in the area. We can see that even though the infrastructure is not overly supportive, there are relatively high volumes through this corridor. So, as previously mentioned, we're looking to complete a 30% preliminary design package, class 3 cost estimate, and detailed design schedule in time for the fall 2022 budget cycle. Detailed design would continue into early 2023, pending that approval, and construction could start as early as mid-2023 or early 2024. As of right now, we envision public engagement in 2 stages. One, in early preliminary design to help further understand how the public experiences and uses the area, and another after preliminary design and budget approval to refine some specific improvements and inform our detailed design work. Current high-level estimated cost for the full scope is in an order of magnitude of 6 to 10 million. And overall, the project is intended to ensure that our necessary deep utility work can be completed, road surface life cycle rehabilitation is completed, road cross sections are suitable for use and brought into alignment with modern standards and current policy, local improvements fit within the context of the overall transportation network, accessibility requirements and user needs, and active connections follow natural desire lines and provide safe access between origins and destinations for the people using them. And that is a quick high-level overview. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much for that presentation, Mr. Reeder and Mr. Asante. Looking to council to see if there are any questions. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. One of the questions I have is those 2 streets in particular experience quite a bit of commercial style parking. And I'm wondering if there's been any discussions on how to manage that moving forward, because it seems to be, I don't want to say out of control, but it's, well, no, I don't, it's not actually out of control, but it doesn't seem fair that that all of that street area, like that it's not really safe to be on your bike or so on and so forth, because there's so much commercial trucks parked along there, and sort of speaks to a business opportunity for somebody with land to have a parking area for their trucks. But I'm just wondering how you're going to plan to manage that, because I think there'll be some like, what? When we're telling them we're placing their parking with a bike lane, which I'm totally cool with, but I just want to know if there's any discussions or conversations on how to manage that.
Yeah, it is something, thank you for the question. It's something that we talked about. We held an internal charter session a few weeks ago, and it's something that we talked about quite a bit. Recognizing it's going to be contentious, but also recognizing that it's, I mean, there is an advantage that those commercial users are getting out of using that space for parking. And it creates a difficult space for users, yes. not just cyclists and pedestrians. Yes. It's not actually a fun road to drive down. No. If there's traffic coming the other way. We talked about a lot of possible ideas to mitigate some of that. One of the things that someone brought up was instituting a commercial permit system, which is an interesting perspective, especially it fits with the paid parking initiatives that we're doing elsewhere in town. And it could be a simple way to bring those volumes down low enough that we're accommodating the people that are willing to pay for it. Yeah, other alternatives. I mean, there's other areas there's other locations in that area that could see increases in parking. And so there will be continued discussions about that. Andy, I don't know if you have more commentary on the whole paid parking piece, but there will be continued discussions, and it's something that Adam and I spoke about when we spoke about engagement planning for this morning, actually. And it's something that we're going to need to think about and be creative about.
And I'll add that there's a lot of parking available right now, which is, I think, something that businesses have adjusted to, an abundance of parking. Some of the concepts we've talked about will still leave a lot of parking available. So there will likely be an impact to the number of stalls, particularly on Glacier, but we recognize not just for business, but also there's pretty significant residential use there.
Yes.
Particularly on the north side. So I believe there will be an opportunity to maintain parking in the design. And it's just a matter of how to make sure it's efficiently used, and to address a business need for, a commercial need for parking isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's something
it's not, and that's why I think it's actually a business opportunity for somebody that has the land to accommodate it, because clearly those trucks are coming home at night, people are picking up their vehicles and going home, and so, you know, in the before times, you had a yard. But I guess I'm also concerned about not just Glacier, but also Elk Run Boulevard. In particular, there's businesses that rely on the street to be able to have their customers park so that they can work on vehicles or equipment or whatever. And I don't know where I would be able to plunk my business in the middle of public property and make money off of it. So it's a bit tricky, definitely. It's going to be a tricky dance, Mr. Sarte.
Yeah, particularly on Elk Run, the majority of parking can be maintained. It's a wide corridor. There's a lot of asphalt there.
It is. You actually have a large palette to deal with in terms of redesigning that street.
So again, it's if there is any reduction, that be accommodated by making sure that it's being efficiently used, and that those that are benefiting from it are contributing to the costs of it. Is one idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Councillor Graham.
I wonder if you alluded to it earlier, Mr. Reader, about public engagement for this, and can you speak to what that might look like over the next little while? I think, you know, we do a lot of these projects and people get to the stage and like, they never consulted us. And I'm hoping we might be able to write that train.
Avoid that. Yes, thank you. I agree 100%. I would like to avoid that as much as possible. Conversation I had this morning, what we're sort of looking at doing, similar to what was done for Railway Avenue a few years ago, there was a map tool where people could go and they could drop a pin on a location and say, this is my comment for this location, or this is my feedback on this location. Allows people to sort of point out user difficulties or things that they like or things that they don't like. So we're hoping to institute something like that early on in conceptual design to sort of inform where we go and how. As far as getting a wide swath of opinion on that, it's a bit difficult. We will probably do mailers to all the businesses, so that, and specifically directing them to the mapping tool so that we can have those conversations and get that feedback. Yeah, outside of that, it's difficult to bring people's attention to this in a quick and efficient manner and make sure everyone feels heard. But that is the intent and that is the hope. Whether that includes some newspaper advertisements or social media direction to the mapping tool, those will be further conversations that I have with Adam. And we'll probably run it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks even. to try and collect as much input as we can.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to helping get the word out for that one any way I can.
Great. Thank you.
Councillor Faubert.
Thank you, Mr. Sarte and Mr. Reader. Silly question, but I feel like it's important to go over just to refresh. What is Glacier Drive being used for parking by businesses now, and why? And what would these changes do, like the proposed change design, how would that affect what's happening, and what solutions are possible?
So we have, thank you for the question. The modern collector cross-section, the preference is to have parking not on both sides for us. Glacier Drive is a little bit of a more narrow corridor than Elk Boulevard, so we have quite a bit less room to work with. Also, the south side of Glacier Drive is difficult topographically. So what will probably be lost along Glacier Drive is one full side of parking. The implications of that are that people stop parking there or people find a new place to park. Hopefully we don't just push the problem into a new location. Yeah.
I might just add, so current use, we're seeing a mix of commercial, and we know that there's use as well for the condominiums on the north side. We're able to collect some basic parking data on utilization there to get an understanding of that, and there will be engagement as well. So as people, I'm guessing some of those businesses, you can see their logos on the vehicle. We know there's pretty significant use by kind of a small handful of businesses take up most of that south side. So there'll be an opportunity, there'll be notice, there's time here. It's not that the cars will be removed next week. There's a couple year time frame here that we're looking at. So I think within that, understanding how the parking is being used, doing the engagement, and then, as Mr. Reader suggested, looking at how we manage parking in the area to accommodate demand and need.
So are businesses just kind of using this as like overflow parking for their vehicles, or do they not have parking? Or should I ask businesses? Sorry.
Everyone using the parking there is using it within the road use bylaw
Okay, yeah.
requirements. So it's being monitored by bylaw, and it's being used.
Yeah.
So
It's municipal enforcement, please.
Yeah. Does this road allow commercial parking and that's why they park there? Or is this just a really easy spot for commercial parking to occur and it's just evolved that way?
It's one of the few areas where you can park commercial vehicles and not necessarily see a lot of complaints because there aren't any directly impacted adjacent properties. There's a steep slope on that south side. So both of these roadways are convenient locations where you can tuck a vehicle, have it sit there for overnight, drive your personal vehicle home. So that's our understanding of the use. It's just a convenient place where no one will raise a fuss.
All right, awesome. So it's not that there's a particular service being delivered in this location on purpose that we are changing. It's that over time, commercial parking has occurred here and is an established type of use as a result. And as we come along and look to change the design, we have to talk to those commercial users about what that looks like.
Yeah, there are impacts. The extent that we're, as a municipality, required to accommodate those impacts for a commercial use, I think, is kind of at the heart of that discussion. But can we do both? Accommodate the needs of the businesses, which I believe are local to that area.
Yeah.
And do it, try to accommodate that in a way that it still allows us to accomplish what needs to be done with the roads for connectivity and safety.
I think we have a great track record of that with like the Safe Park program. Instead of just saying, no, you can't do that, we find a way to make it work.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Looking to see if there are any other questions. Seeing none. Mr. Sarte, Mr. Reader, thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you.
Now I'm looking to move to item D5. Do we have, on Zoom? Okay. Ms. Richardson is joining us on Zoom. Welcome to council.
Good afternoon, and sorry, I apologize. I'm not there in person like usual, but I'm a little bit under the weather, so don't want to risk spreading this around. Let's see if I remember how to share presentations now that we're back to this. Hopefully everyone is now seeing my presentation. So good afternoon, Mayor and councillors. I'm here today to provide some preliminary information on property tax rates for 2022. Update to where we are currently sitting in the process. Property assessments notices were mailed on February 14th, and now property owners have until the 25th, so next Monday, to resolve any questions with the assessor or to file a formal assessment appeal. So given that, the information and numbers in the accompanying briefing are the most recent available, but there will be some minor adjustments between the numbers presented today and the final numbers in the bylaw I'll be presenting at the May 3rd meeting. So some procedural notes right off the bat. The final rates must be set by bylaw, and that responsibility cannot be delegated. Everything has been prepared in accordance with the property tax policy, which was approved back in 2015. Each year, council approves the budget for the upcoming year, which determines the amount of money needed to operate the municipality, the total budget. And then from this amount, revenues from other sources such as sales and rentals, permits and fines, grants, etc., are deducted. And what's left is the amount of money the town needs to raise through property taxes. This total to be collected through taxes can be further broken down into three components: the municipal taxes and the vital homes amount. So those are the two we'll be talking about in today's presentation. And then the estimate for supplementary taxes, which is collected later in the year and not included in the following calculation of the preliminary mill rates. There are additional amounts as well that need to be collected through property taxes. So as we just discussed, the municipal taxes and the vital homes amount are set through the budget process. The seniors requisition amount comes from Bow Valley Regional Housing. The provincial education taxes are based on the preliminary 2022 requisition we've received from the province. And finally, the designated industrial property tax requisition comes directly from municipal affairs. So the analogy we've used in previous years is of pies. So these would be the different pies we're going to collect. After we have the total amounts to collect, we look at how to split that amount out between residential and non-residential properties, with the objective of equity and competitiveness in the distribution of the residential and non-residential tax share. So to extend that analogy, this is how we would split our municipal tax pie. We are recommending to keep that split at 65 residential, 35 non-residential, which is consistent with last year and in line with our competitors and neighbors. That analysis was provided as attachment 1 within the briefing, so that's page 66 if you're following along in your package, and I'll also be walking through it a little bit here. So our property tax policy asks that we look at how that split is sitting with respect to both our competitors and our neighbors. This data is all based on 2021, which is the most recent complete year available. With competitors, the first data set we're going to look at, we're looking at those municipalities that are in the same or similar market from an economic perspective. On the left, we have the assessment share, and on the right, we have the tax share. And for both, we're looking at that split between residential and non-residential. And Canmore in both charts were the green and purple bar that kind of lies towards the middle. On the left, we can see the average assessment share is 82 residential, 18 non-residential, and here in Canmore, we're at an 85-15. When we move over to the tax share on the right, we see the average of our competitors was at 67.33, which again supports maintaining that historic split at 65 residential, 35 non-residential for ours. When we move on to our neighbors, so these are those that are in closest proximity to us. Again, it's the same types of data. So we have the assessment share on the left and the tax share on the right, both split between residential and non-residential. The average split for the assessment for our neighbors is 79.21. And as a reminder, ours is unchanged. It's just who we're comparing it to. Ours was at that 85.15. And again, when we move over to the tax share, the average split for our neighbors was 69.31 versus again, our 65.35. So overall, across those two slides and the four charts, you can see we're roughly sitting towards the middle of those charts for both data sets for our competitors and our neighbors. And we believe this all goes to support maintaining our planned tax split at 65.35. So once we have those splits, the next step is to divide each of those split portions based on the assessed values. So to continue that analogy, how we slice those kind of pie splits up is through assessment, and it determines the relative size of the slices. The assessment needs to comply with the standard of assessment regulation that's established in the Municipal Government Act. And then the audit branch of Alberta Municipal Affairs monitors those assessments to confirm assessors have applied legislation appropriately. The assessments are prepared using the same value standards. And so the subsequent assessments are, to use their language, fair and equitable. So for a little more about that process, assessments in Alberta are prepared using mass appraisal, which values a group of properties based on common data, mathematical models, and statistical tests. So it's efficient in that it allows our assessors to accurately value a large number of properties in a short time frame. And so these are the results for this year. So this is the assessment information in aggregate with the totals by classification. The increase in taxable assessment from last year to this year is 632 million, and that is composed of two pieces. So the first is real growth, and that's the assessed value of new properties that did not previously exist. And the second component is market growth, or the net increase in the assessed value of existing properties. So those two are 146 million and 486 million respectively, which totals the 632 million increase in taxable assessment growth year over year. One note on the classifications. So each year, owners of tourist home properties who are not renting their property out have the option of completing a statutory declaration that they are using it personally in accordance with our property tax policy. Fluctuations in the value of the properties in the two tourist home classifications depends on which properties file that declaration in any given year. Now, if we take the total assessments by classification and split it by the number of properties in each category, we have an average assessment by classification. Just a reminder, an average is simply that. It's not necessarily indicative of any individual specific property or individual specific tax burden. Once we get to the final mill rates in May, I'll switch to talking more about median properties rather than the simple averages, because that maybe gives a bit of a better indicator of what an average property, what an indicative property, I should say, is by looking at the median of the data set rather than the simple average. Again, as was clarified with the last chart, the difference between the tourist home and tourist home personal use from year to year depends on which individual properties file that statutory declaration in that given year. So the difference in value doesn't necessarily have to do with the classification itself, but which properties fall into that classification from year to year. So what that all means then is we'll take the amounts from the budget and the received requisitions. We determine the split that we looked at, and then each split is further divided by the assessment data. This then calculates the tax rate, and that tax rate is applied to each individual property assessment to determine the taxes payable by that property. When we talk about mill rates, the mill rate is the amount of tax payable per dollar of assessed value, and it's based on mills, which is 1,000th of a currency unit, so it's 1/10 of a cent. So Sorry, I'm probably using the two kind of interchangeably, but that's the difference between when some places put their tax rate and when we reference our mill rate. It's per thousand of assessed value. So this is where our preliminary mill rates land. Again, these are likely to change with the final assessment numbers once any last changes are received. A few items I wanted to note here. So one, this is where you can see the multiplier that is applied on tourist homes of 2.9 to 1. And secondly, per the MGA, municipalities are to conform to a non-residential to residential mill rate ratio of no more than 5 to 1. And you can see we're well under that threshold at 3.07 to 1. So when we compare ourselves to our competitors, again, we use that same set of municipalities we looked at previously. On the left, just to give you a bit of a sense of scale of who we're comparing ourselves to and our proportional size, this is the number of dwellings for each of those competitors we looked at. And on the right, we have the 2021 residential tax per dwelling. So as you can see, the average for our competitors is $1,690. And for 2021, we were sitting slightly higher than that at $1,819, but still kind of in the middle of that spread. When we move on to our neighbors, again, on the left is the sense of comparative size of those neighbors, while on the right, we have the residential tax per dwelling for our neighbors. Here you can see the average residential tax per dwelling for our neighbors is $1,865, and we were sitting slightly below that at $1,819. Chestermere and Beaumont there at the top, I would note, are kind of outliers. So if we take them out of the average, it does drop to $1,783. Overall, we're sitting kind of between our competitors and neighbors, and again, are roughly in the middle of these data ranges, again, based on our policies and the proposed split. So that concludes my presentation today, and I'd like to open it up to any questions. The one thing I was going to note is if there are scenarios that you would like to see modeled, if those could be discussed today, that gives us time to perform any necessary analysis between now and when the final mill rates will be brought forward at the May meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson, and thank you for being with us today, even though you're not feeling well. Just a question on one of the very last points you made, and you know, if we removed a couple of outliers, did you give any consideration in this particular calculation of removing Banff as a outlier on the other end of the spectrum?
We didn't. When I've looked at the last few years, Beaumont and Chestermere have been outliers for a little while. So even when we looked at this data set last year, there's kind of been a trend there. And so we removed them. So at this point, we hadn't given consideration to removing Banff at the other end. But again, that is absolutely something we can do easily and bring back that revised average, maybe with the top two knocked off and the bottom, if that's information that council would like.
I personally like them all included. I was just wondering if you're going to be removing some, why not do that one? I expect that Banff won't be as much of an outlier this coming year because of the ratio adjustment, or because of the changes they've had to make due to the adjustments, because of the ratio to be within the 5 to 1. So thank you for that. So when we're looking at this information, it really is important for us to be taking a look at our average per dwelling, as opposed to trying to compare mill rates or anything like that. Correct?
Correct, and that was a change, I believe, that was recommended in the property tax policy, that we don't need to be at the exact average, but kind of approximating that, the middle of the range, and looking at this data set every year. The mill rates, just as a number, doesn't necessarily tell the whole story so much as looking at some of these residential tax per dwelling, which was why that move was strategically made a number of years ago, and we've been comparing ourselves to the same data set in those years.
I do very much appreciate this information. There's various pieces of information that we get, some of it through the citizen satisfaction survey, and this being another type of information that is used a lot because it really does bring some perspective to our taxes, and it's based on actual data. As one might expect, people tend to think that we are taxed highly here in Canmore, when in fact the reality is that we are right around average, if not below average. Yeah. Looking to council for any questions. Councillor Faubert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Ms. Richardson, for your presentation. The education tax requisition went up 7% this year. Do you have a record of the percentage increase over the past 10 years that the province has increased that by? Or do you know on average?
Not at my fingertips, but that's absolutely the type of information that that we can pull together for the next meeting. That is generally one of the things that the town has experienced, that this year, I think the average requisition increase overall was 1.3%. Last year, the messaging from the province was that it had been held flat, but since it's allocated to municipalities based on our assessment share, that hasn't been the case for Canmore, where, as you referenced, we've been receiving increases that are significantly higher than that, again, based on our assessment growth. So I don't have that number at my fingertips, but we can absolutely look at how that's been trending in recent years. But I will say we do tend to, again, based on our property values and our assessment growth, we've been seeing larger than average increases compared to other municipalities and what we pay in the property tax requisition.
Yeah, and it's challenging because we don't set this, we don't choose this, but we are the face of collecting it, and you're the face of explaining it. So, so it's, I feel like it's a good thing to have a better understanding about. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
For your presentation. I'm not used to getting one at Committee of the Whole just before we set the tax rate, so I appreciate it. One of the questions I have is with regards to the tourist home tax rate. And I understand that you're following the Property Tax Task Force recommendations relatively to the T in that, and that the Property Tax Task Force report recommended that there be more discussion around council about that particular rate. But I'm wondering if there's been any discussion within finance itself in the last few years about aligning the tourist home rate with the commercial rate. Or non-residential rate. Sorry, I used the wrong term. Non-residential rate.
So I wouldn't say necessarily discussion on alignment per se, but I think there has been a lot of internal discussion. And unfortunately, the tourist home, I think, as you're aware, it's something that came up with last council's term, and again with COVID, some of that work hasn't happened in the timeframes we'd hoped. But it is one of those areas that we've identified that are potentially due for a review. And so, unfortunately, it wouldn't just be finance. My understanding is there would be a planning component of that as well. To do with land use bylaw and other pieces as well. So it's definitely not work we could undertake in isolation. I think the whole tourist home subclass is potentially something that we would want to look at. It's something we've identified as a potential project for the coming years. And it's just where that fits in with other strategic priorities that might be coming forward in terms of our work plan for coming years. But it's definitely something that has been flagged for consideration for quite a while, because it is kind of it's unique to Canmore, and it does kind of exist somewhere between residential and non-residential.
I would say that without the personal, if you're not taking the personal use designation, that it is commercial. Boom. These units are going toe-to-toe with the commercial sector, and in my opinion should be treated exactly the same from a tax perspective. And so I was wondering, Your Worship, if you would like a motion at Committee of the Whole to ask administration to bring back modeling with regards to taxation and aligning the tourist home zoning with the non-residential zoning, Or is that something that I could just ask administration to do and they could bring that back when they bring the tax rate back for approval? We're not deciding on it today, we're just seeing what kind of revenue it could potentially.
I'm wondering if that's, and in fact, I was wondering about this report too, if it would be best handled in the Finance Committee as a recommendation, and we meet next week, and so I'm wondering if perhaps between now and then you could perhaps work with administration to fine-tune what a motion could look like.
And bring that forward at
the
Finance Committee. So it is the next week we're approving the tax rate?
No.
Oh, okay, so it's just being presented at Finance Committee next. I haven't seen that agenda, so I don't know.
I haven't.
You have.
I haven't either. I'm taking a look here. No, we have a Finance Committee meeting next week.
Right.
I actually, maybe in the future, we'd actually deal with this at the Finance Committee meeting in the future. But this is prepping for us for, it's probably May that we'll be approving the tax rate. Right.
Yeah.
And if I may, there was consideration given to doing the preliminary property tax rates at the Finance Committee meeting next week. The challenge is if council did have any feedback or comments based on today, to turn it around, the agenda would basically be published the next day. So it's really about allowing us sufficient time to address any comments between these preliminary rates and the final rates in the Finance Committee meeting. It's always really tight because of the audited financial statements. So we've just received those from Avail last week, so we couldn't really move that one up any, but we also needed time to process any of this to have it on the regular May agenda. So that's kind of, unfortunately, some of the challenges we have around timing with some of these issues at this time of year.
So I guess in answer to Councillor McCallum's question, Dr. Kyle, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think just to Ms. Richardson's point, it actually would probably be preferable to get it today, because if we wait till the Finance Committee meeting, the agenda
has to be turned around the next day.
Goes out the next day for the May 3rd council meeting.
I just want to make it clear, I'm just looking to see what the numbers would shake out, and then we, as a council, can make a decision from there. I understand that there's all kinds of like land use and policy and everything else. I'm just talking about the tax piece. That's the only thing I want to talk about today. And I just, really don't understand why it's not much lower. It's very slight, but I still I've never really understood why it was lower. I think it was more of a cottage industry when let's just say that the tourist home zoning had a completely different beginning than where it is right now, 15, almost 20 years later. So, but I just think in terms of tax equity and providing equity across the board, these tourist home, non-personal use, are a business. They are a commercial entity. And I think that it's only fair, especially with what the last 2 years the hotels have dealt with in this community, that there is some tax equity across the board. And so I'm just looking to see the modeling numbers, and maybe it's not worth doing it, but I just think it's worth looking at.
Yeah, so I think the best way to deal with this is perhaps by undertaking by administration to provide that information. I'm getting a little bit stuck on process here, because committee of the whole directing something for Finance Committee, and I know we're all the same people, but it's a different set of minutes and the whole thing and how they start to work together. So if administration is prepared to bring back that information for the Finance Committee meeting next week as part of the discussion then, and I haven't seen the agenda, so I don't know exactly what we're talking about. I know that there are members of this council that would like to have a fulsome conversation around our taxes and potentially additional subclasses and all those sorts of things. So I don't know if that's maybe the start of that discussion next week, with this being some of the information that would inform that discussion, right?
Just one last piece I would clarify. So if we were to explore a rate for the tourist homes that more closely proxied the non-residential rate rather than the current multiplier on the residential rate. It wouldn't, again, I think this is one thing that there's often misconceptions about how the tax process works, is our overall collection won't change. That's still determined by the budget. Just, I think worth reiterating for the public, it would change the split between, you know, potentially what residential properties are paying and those tourist homes that are also in that residential subclass. So it just changes the split within that assessment class. It wouldn't bring in more revenue overall for the town. It's just how it's divided up.
I completely understand that, Ms. Richardson. I'm just looking at, you know, we did this, the property tax task force met in what, 2012, 2013?
Yeah.
And so that's been 10 years, and I think it's actually served us well. But this conversation about tax equity has become more acute in my mind between these two particular classes. And I'd like to just do it. Like if council thinks it's good, we can have those other bigger conversations later. Those are more planned out. There's some education rollout. I'm just talking about aligning that particular class with the non-residential class. That's all. So I don't know, again, what do you want me to do?
Thank you. Learning. I think, Ms. Richardson, if you're good with this, you let me know if you're not. For the Finance Committee next week, there's just 3 staff reports, and it's all year-end. It's capital project closeout, it's what we're doing with the surplus, and it's the audited financials. But we could bring a verbal presentation that speaks to this issue of what the implication would be if we made that change. So then council could have the theoretical discussion at the Finance Committee, and then it would give us a quick turnaround if we need to change it for the agenda, but it would give us a bit of time. I'm wondering if that works for you. Ms. Richardson, if that's clear for you. Sorry.
That was to me, yes. Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was to me or Councillor McCallum. Absolutely, yeah. So between now and, again, I think our plan is to print that agenda package tomorrow. So again, likely wouldn't have time to turn around a report in the next 24 hours on that, but a verbal report is absolutely doable for the Finance Committee next week.
I think that would be the best way to proceed, because then Finance Committee, who is tasked with advising council on these matters,
can actually
make a motion at that time if based on that information, we would like to advise a change in how the calculation is done between the two.
Perfect.
All right.
I'm easy, just not cheap.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Ms. Richardson. I think maybe just a couple comments. I'm very much along the lines of with Councillor Joanna. That's all I got this afternoon. Callum, thank you. Thank you. Play the name game today. Yeah, I would very much like to look at the ratios of a couple of these classes and see what we might be able to do there. But I was quite surprised that we only have $53 million worth of vacant land in town. I thought that number was, there are those that would argue that number is significantly higher. I was surprised at that number.
So that is only serviced vacant land. It is distinct. Vacant land that is unserviced is rolled into the residential category. And then there are also vacant categories, I think commercial and non-residential. We actually have 2 separate classifications we use for assessment for those. And those would be both rolled into the non-residential side as well. So
okay.
That isn't the only vacant land. It would need to be residential and it would need to be serviced to fall into that category. So there are 3 other classifications of vacant land that you won't see within that total.
Okay. So that they would separate out otherwise. Okay, that makes more sense to me. And just for my own information, what is machinery and equipment, including linear? I don't know what that would be. Yeah, I don't even know what it is though.
So machinery and equipment, municipalities do have the opportunity to assess, I guess, not just the land and the building itself, but any manufacturing machinery and equipment that may be within that. We do that only in, I believe, very limited kind of circumstances. And then linear, I don't have the definition in front of me, but I believe that includes things like railways, kind of utility right-of-ways, those types of things, linear utility pieces that are tracks. I'm sorry, I don't have it right in front of me.
Under the MGA,
Linear.
there's four main categories: residential, non-residential, machinery, equipment, and linear. And we typically deal mostly in residential and non-residential. Some of it's not even assessed, like the machinery, equipment, and linear. Typically, the province is involved in some of that, and it's very small in our community. So that's what those are.
Didn't even know what it was. Thank you.
Correct. So the linear are assessors. I don't even believe they assess those. Some of that, as Mayor Crowsert said, come directly from the province.
Yeah. Councillor Ma.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson. I hope you feel better soon. We had a bit of an email dialogue with regards to why the vacant service is taxed at the same ratio as residential, and then the explanation was that, quote unquote, this is from the Property Tax Task Force. Well, the intent of the policy was to create a disincentive for businesses to hold and speculate on land. The effect is the creation of horizontal inequities within the tax base, both relative to the residential base and to other industries. I don't understand what that means when they say horizontal inequities.
Sorry, so I guess what I was quoting there was, so in 2015 with the property tax policy, and it was new at that point, we made the change was made as reflected in the language of the policy that vacant land, vacant residential land, I'll clarify, is taxed at the same rate as residential land. So I think one of the legacy pieces that we have here that vacant serviced is broken out separately as a category is because historically, prior to that 2015 policy adoption, vacant serviced residential land had been taxed at a higher rate than the rest of the residential classification. And so in the analysis that was done to support the property tax task force, that's always a tongue twister for me, and the accompanying policy that was adopted, that analysis recommended moving away from that higher percentage that was applied to the vacant serviced land versus residential and using the same for both, referencing kind of those horizontal inequities, and also that generally vacant service land isn't utilizing our town services and infrastructure in the same way it is once it's developed, so that from a cost benefit perspective, it was kind of deemed unequal from a benefits perspective for those properties to be paying more when they're actually receiving less from in terms of the services and infrastructure we provide. And then with the horizontal inequities, it was, I believe, just referencing other residential properties that it wasn't necessarily equal to be charging more for vacant land than similar other properties, especially once those kind of benefits are factored in. Again, those were recommendations that were made at the time that policy was implemented based on the analysis that had been done, and we've been following those recommendations that were made ever since.
Okay, thank you.
Good to see if there are any other questions. Seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Richardson. All right, so we will now move to item E1, Councillor Updates. And as I'm sorry, Councillor McCallum?
Can I clarify something with the regards to the councillor updates?
Yes.
So you will note that both Councillor Faubert and I have provided a report on Bow Valley Regional Transit Services Commission. I had no business providing a report, but I had actually thought I was at that meeting because I had read the agenda and I had watched the video. So don't pay attention to my report, pay attention to Councillor Faubert's. Because last night or the other day I was reading the package and I'm going, wait, how come there's two of us reporting? And then I went back and looked and I'm like, I actually didn't go to that meeting. I just read the agenda. So anyways, that was the only thing I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, looking to our updates then. As is our usual practice, we'll go one by one and see if there's any questions based on what a particular member of council has reported. Well, I've got a bunch of people on the speaking queue here. I'm going to clear the queue. I'll ask the question if there's any questions on my report. Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Mayor Krauser. I was wondering if you could enlighten us a little bit on the resort municipality status conversation that you had with CAO of Banff and Jasper.
Yeah, so we talk regularly in the sense of every couple of months. We talked before and after the Alberta Municipalities Conference, and most recently with Mayor D'Amano and myself meeting with MLA Rosen and talking about where we think we may be. We decided that we'd have a conversation amongst all the 3 municipalities to determine what our best next step would be, given that realistically we have a small window ahead of us before everything provincially gets put on hold for an election coming at some point in the next year.
Agreed.
And so we talked about where we're at and what the recent conversations we've had. And our next step is the 3 municipalities will be meeting with our 2 MLAs and basically setting the course for a discussion with multiple ministries with the province coming together. In the past, it's been strictly municipal affairs, but we do recognize that jobs and innovation, which cover tourism, has some interest in that as well. And one of our MLAs is the secretary for tourism. And so we're just going to be talking about with them, getting their advice on the best way to move that discussion forward with the province, so that we can, because the feeling is that we've put in a lot of information over the years and brought many ministers up to speed and then responded with additional information as requested, and that there is potentially some alignment there, and we just need to have that conversation as to how we move it from where we are here to some form of action. So that's really what the essence of our conversation.
I think that's a great conversation. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you. Any other questions on my report? See none. Any question on Councillor Faubert's report? Councillor Faubert, you have a question on your report.
Yeah. I wanted to say I had a brain moment on when I put together my stats, and I called it the Waste Services Commission, not the Transit Services Commission. What? And that's it. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none. Councillor Graham's report. Moving to Councillor Hillstad's report. Councillor Maw's report. Councillor Graham.
Sorry. There's 80,000 left in the accessory dwelling, and that can be accessed this year, is that correct?
Councillor Hillstad?
Yeah, so the matching down deposit's fully subscribed, but the accessory dwelling one has still got money in it to be accessed, so.
Does that roll over, unaccessed money, does that roll into next year's budget?
Yeah, it'll depend on what the board decides next year. If we feel we're getting value for it, or if we switch up programs, or, because we've already moved some money that was in that program last year into the matching down because that was getting more subscribed to. So it's kind of ebbing and flowing as things go on. So we'll see.
And roughly 80,000 would, how many applicants could access that 80,000?
It depends because it's up to 20, or it's up to 20,000, or it's up to a certain percentage of the cost. So essentially, they might use less than 20, and so it just depends on what comes through. So they have up to 20, depending on what their construction costs are. So so roughly four for sure.
Okay.
So it'd be 4 for sure, and then depending on if someone only ends up using a small amount, then potentially more. But
awesome. Thank you for that clarification.
Any question on Councillor Ma's report? And Councillor Mara's report. And Councillor McCallum's report disregarding 7B.
Although between the two, it's very fulsome.
Yeah, I thought
We didn't really repeat each other much.
I liked it. All right. Moving on then to, oh, there's lots of attachments here, to the administrative update. Going by section, CAO's office. Any questions of the CAO's office? Okay. Seeing none. Moving to municipal services. Councillor Ma.
Under protective services number 4, it says Canmore residential parking permit applications opened mid-April. That's a moving target now, right?
There was a delay getting that launched. It's now projected early May.
Okay, thanks. Just checking.
I think that was a matter of reports being submitted when one timeline was in place and the timeline changing since the submission. Yeah. But thank you for pointing that out. I also have a question under 4 protective services, under 4C. It says plans for emergency preparedness week are being finalized in collaboration with the communications department. What can we expect in that regard, and when will we know what's being rolled out?
I'll need to follow up on details there, but typically it's an education campaign. I think occasionally there's a gathering and maybe a breakfast that occurs. Am I correct in that?
So a pancake breakfast and probably an awareness campaign about checking the batteries in your fire alarms and have a plan and all that sort of thing? Okay, great.
We'll get back to you on the breakfast.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions under municipal services? Moving to corporate services. Any questions? Oh, Councillor Moore, do you have?
No, it's just a long one.
Legacy? Okay. Anything under corporate services? Okay, moving to D, municipal infrastructure. Mr. Sarte, are you sitting in on this one? Okay, I don't know if you will know this answer. Let's see. Which, there you go into that one there? Okay. I'm just wondering what the timing is on hiring a planner who's going to look after the Palliser and downtown ARPs. I don't know if you know that or if Dr. Cottle knows that.
We'll find out.
Okay. Well, while looking into that, because I've been actually asked multiple times in the last week about this, as they're both high priority activities, I'm just hoping that, you know, that as our expectations are, is that we can expect that the work will start this year and ideally be done sometime in 2023. And I know that there's been comments and reports about 2024, but the feedback I'm getting is that that's a long time out. Yeah, yeah.
You know, we can ask either Ms. Smithers or Ms. Miller to have an update on that for the May cow.
Great, thank you. Sorry for making you move seats there, Mr. Sarte. But before you move back, are there any other questions around municipal infrastructure? Councillor Mara?
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. I've been asked several questions regarding the light at the intersection, regarding when the middle lanes lights will be dropped. Just wondering if we're on top of that or if we're waiting for something or...
Scheduled for first week of May.
Perfect. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Regarding the box. The control panel box. There's two questions, I think, Councillor, it was brought up. One, it was obviously, there was some damage done to it, and two, do we have a backup or any, like, if there is damage done to the control box? What's that? There wasn't damage? Oh, there was no damage to the box. I apologize. That's my mistake. The question came from the possibility of.
I'll have to follow up. I actually wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Well, there was no damage. I misspoke there.
Okay.
So it's the possibility of. What would happen if it failed, or do we have any backup regarding the control box?
Control boxes are fail-safe, so if there is an issue, it'll go into a four-way flash, and then our service technician will have notification on their device and will respond 24 hours depending on what the particular issue is and where it's located. So,
thank you, and I'm sorry, apologize for that mistake.
No problem.
But is the box in? It's done? We had this conversation this morning. Some people thought it was installed, some people thought it wasn't. It is in.
So we're now nearly 3 weeks into operation with the new signal control, which has allowed us to do quite a few different things with the phasing there. The first week that it was in operation was a pretty heavy traffic week, and we saw volumes similar to a busy summer day actually going through there, and it operated within one signal cycle for all movement directions. And so that's quite promising. It's working even better than we would have projected in those higher volume times based on the planning work we did. And now we're working on some optimization. So it's given us more flexibility. We have an initial phasing that's in place right now. We had a discussion last week about some of the things that we're observing and whether we can optimize that. So that'll be done through May. And the goal is to have both the signal lowering and the signals set with the new phasing for the May long weekend.
Okay. Councillor Hillstad, did you have a question?
Yep. As there was a bit of a mix-up yesterday at the intersection and the light stand got hit, I'm just curious, how are, like, for design-wise, like, how many hits can it take? Or, like, at what point do we, know, like, because, like, if you drive by it, it doesn't look like anything happened to it, just because I drove by after it was cleaned up and you can't even tell that anything happened. But just curious how that all works, like, how they're designed, like, at what point do we have to go out and, like, inspect and make sure that it's good to go?
Each time it's hit, it should be inspected. Yeah. So that will happen, and they are pretty robust structures. The structure itself, its primary way of failing is actually from wind loading. Over time, that fatigue causes the structure to collapse. So that they're way overbuilt for just holding up a couple lights in the air. So they tend to be quite robust when they get hit. But they do need to be inspected each time to make sure that the bolts aren't damaged and that it's in good shape.
Thank you.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just following up with Councillor Mara's question, if the control box was, heaven forbid, run over, do we have a backup, a spare, because that one took us a long time to get in. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I can't hear.
Yep.
It would take quite a while. So
we would be in four-way stops for a year? Is that what you
four-way flash for a year. There are a number of components that are inside a cabinet, plus the cabinet itself. So it's unlikely that you would have a total loss of a cabinet. And in that circumstance, you'd patch together back to where we were at 4 weeks ago, using traditional equipment that's readily available on hand, and then order whatever parts need to be replaced. So there wouldn't be a long period of time where it wouldn't be operational. It just might be not operating as optimally for a period of time.
What's the control box worth?
The entire box with labor for installation and associated wiring is $55,000 for one of those.
Sounds pretty cheap to have one on backup. Just saying. For a situation that might never occur.
Councillor Faubert.
Thank you. Andy, I had a question follow-up after you had said something. Do you get real-time stats about the amount of traffic going through that intersection, or is it like a day later? Like, do you have like a speedometer on your computer that tells us how busy we are?
Oh, no. Answer this properly. She's going to be in your office.
We can prepare reports with a 2-week lead time. No. We do have cameras mounted at the intersection. It gives real-time data using recognition software that can observe the difference between a vehicle, a truck, a bus, a pedestrian, a person walking. It's quite new technology to be able to use cameras for that purpose, and it works incredibly well. So we are getting right now real-time statistics and can go back and view footage and collect data from when it started last July.
Yeah, because I know like Banff does measure in and out, but it has 2 entrances, so it's a lot easier. And Canmore has never had a good metric of like how busy was the town this weekend, but now we do. That's a great one.
Yeah, we have, with that year's worth of data, we can tell whether it's all in 15-minute periods, so it's very easy to tell whether that was a busy long weekend or not. We're comparing to last summer, so it'll take a couple more years of data to see what a typical summer is. Maybe last summer wasn't typical. But we do have good reference points now, so we can see how is it performing during a busy Friday afternoon right now, and how does that compare to a busy Friday afternoon in August.
It's already come in useful for me because you've referenced before how busy, like a week, there was a week in January that was almost as busy as a long weekend in summer. And someone had complained to me that the intersection was clogged because of the intersection. I was like, actually, the numbers suggest that we had as many people going through there as a long weekend in the summer. So that's what you were experiencing. So that data, thumbs up.
Great. Any other questions on the administration updates? Great, thank you. Turning to item G, council resolution action lists. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that? Any questions around or comments around the correspondence? It's mostly there for information. Okay, seeing none then, just looking to Dr. Cottle about our in-camera session. So we would go in camera now. We're not making any decisions. we'll just be closing the committee of the whole following the in-camera.
Correct.
And so I'm not sure if we're queued up to go with that, but I'll just move to go in camera now and then we'll proceed. Okay, so I will move that we take the meeting in camera to prevent disclosure of information subject to solicitor-client privilege in accordance with Section 27, Sub 1, Sub A of the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy Act. All those in favor? Carried unanimously.
I might have to step out halfway through the in-camera session.
Okay, well, we'll deal with that. Yep.